Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to step back in time, and not just a little way back, not to castles or pyramids, but way, way back. Back to a time when the world itself was a different beast, a colder, harsher, and in many ways a far grander place. We're going to talk about the Ice Age, and more importantly, we're going to explore the story of our own ancestors, those tiny, clever, and unbelievably tough humans who looked at a world of colossal glaciers and landscapes frozen solid, and somehow, against all odds, decided to call it home. It's a story of incredible resilience, of grit and ingenuity that's baked right into our DNA. It's the story of how we survived. Before we get truly lost in the past, if you enjoy what I do here, if these little journeys help you unwind, a simple like or subscribe really does help the channel find other people who might need a quiet story at the end of the day. And as always, I love to see where everyone is listening from. It's remarkable to think of us all, scattered across the globe in our own comfortable beds, all tuning in to the same quiet corner of history. So feel free to leave a comment with your city or country. It's just nice to know we're all in this together. No pressure at all though. The most important thing is that you feel comfortable. And speaking of which, now is the time to do just that. Let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, take a slow deep breath, dim the lights, pull up the covers, maybe turn on a fan for that soft steady hum. Get settled. There's nothing else you need to do right now except listen. Let the day fade away. We're leaving it all behind. We're going on a journey to a world of ice. Chapter 1. A World of Ice. The Pleistocene Epoch. Before we can even begin to understand the lives of our ancient relatives, we have to first understand the stage on which their incredible story unfolded. And this stage was not like ours. The very planet was in a different mood. For the better part of 2.5 million years, a geological epoch we call the Pleistocene, the Earth was in a state of profound and recurring cold. This wasn't a single monolithic ice age like you see in the movies, one long, unending winter. It was far more dynamic, more rhythmic than that. It was a series of long, brutal glacial periods, the ice ages with a lowercase r, punctuated by shorter, warmer spells called interglacials, like the one we're enjoying right now. Our entire recorded human history, from the first cities to the device you're listening on, has taken place within one of these brief, balmy intermissions. We are the children of a temporary thaw. The real story of the Pleistocene was the ice, and the engine driving this colossal climate control system wasn't on Earth at all. It was written in the stars, in the planet's very posture as it moved through space. It's a set of cosmic mechanics known as the Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian astronomer who painstakingly calculated them a century ago. It sounds complicated, but it's really just about the Earth's slow, gentle, and slightly wobbly dance around the Sun. Imagine, if you will, the Earth's orbit not as a perfect circle, but as a slight oval. Over a cycle of about 100,000 years, this oval gently stretches, becoming more elongated, and then relaxes back towards a more circular shape. This is called eccentricity. When the orbit is more stretched out, the Earth spends more time farther away from the Sun, its primary source of warmth. It receives less energy overall, a little less solar energy, year after year, century after century, millennia after millennia. It adds up. It's the first little nudge towards cold. Then there's the tilt of our planet's axis. We all know the Earth is tilted, which is what gives us our seasons. Right now it's about 23.5 degrees, but this tilt isn't fixed. Over a cycle of about 41,000 years, it rocks back and forth, very slowly, between about 22 degrees and 24.5 degrees. It's a tiny change, a barely perceptible nod, but its consequences are enormous. A greater tilt means more extreme seasons, hotter summers and colder winters. A lesser tilt means the opposite, milder seasons, cooler summers and milder winters. And the key here isn't the colder winter as you might expect, it's the cooler summer. Because if the summer in the high northern latitudes in places like Canada, Scandinavia and Siberia isn't warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow, that snow sticks around, and the next winter more snow falls on top of it. And the summer after that, even less of it melts. This is how a glacier is born. A cool summer is the secret ingredient for growing an ice age. Finally, there's a wobble. Just like a spinning top starts to wobble as it slows down, The Earth wobbles on its axis in a slow 26,000-year cycle called precession. This wobble changes which hemisphere is pointed towards the Sun when the Earth is at its closest point in its orbit. It determines which hemisphere gets the more intense summer sun. Now, any one of these cycles on its own is just a subtle climate influencer, but every so often, by pure celestial chance, the cycles align in a perfect storm of cold. The Earth's orbit is stretched out and elliptical. Its tilt is minimized, making for milder, cooler summers. And the wobble ensures that the northern hemisphere, where most of the world's land is, experiences these cool summers when the Earth is farthest from the Sun. When these three rhythms fall into sync, it's like a cosmic signal is sent to the planet. The thermostat is turned down, not by 1 or 2 degrees, but by many. The great cooling begins, and so the snows begin to fall across the vast northern continents. And they do not melt. Year after year, the snowpack deepens. The weight of the new layers of snow compresses the layers beneath, squeezing out the air, transforming the fluffy white powder into dense granular ice called firn. As the weight continues to mount, this firn is compressed even further, becoming something else entirely, glacial ice. A different substance, crystalline, ancient, and an ethereal shade of blue, a blue born from immense pressure and the absence of air. This wasn't happening in just a few mountain valleys. This was happening on a continental scale. In North America, the ice began to grow from centers in the Canadian Arctic and Hudson Bay. It coalesced into a single titanic entity that geologists call the Laurentide ice sheet. To call it a sheet is a charming understatement. At its peak, this single body of ice covered virtually all of Canada and stretched south, burying New England, New York, the Great Lakes, and pushing down past Chicago into the American Midwest. It was a solid, unbroken wall of ice, and it was thick. We're not talking about a few feet of ice. We are talking about ice that was, in many places, 1, 2, or even 3 kilometers thick, a mile or more. Imagine the tallest skyscraper in your nearest city. Now stack another one on top of it, and another, and another. That is the scale we are dealing with. A mountain range of frozen water, created from snowfall. The sheer weight of it was so immense that it physically pushed the Earth's crust down into the mantle, depressing the land beneath it by hundreds of feet. The planet itself sagged under the burden. Across the Atlantic, a sister ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, was growing over Scandinavia, Finland, and northwestern Russia. It buried the British Isles, with only the very southern tip of England peeking out. It covered Germany and Poland. These two great ice domes, Laurentide and Fennoscandian, were the cold, beating hearts of the Ice Age. And they were not static. Glaciers, despite being solid ice, flow. They move. Under their own colossal weight, they deform and creep outwards from their centres. Like an infinitely slow pour of cosmic honey, they groaned and cracked, the sound echoing for miles across the frozen silence. They were unstoppable bulldozers of nature. As they advanced south, they scraped the landscape bare. They plucked 1,000-ton boulders from mountainsides and carried them for hundreds of miles, dropping them in alien valleys. They carved deep U-shaped valleys out of V-shaped river gorges. They ground entire mountains down to their stubs, pulverizing rock into a fine powder called glacial flour. The Great Lakes of North America are the puddles left behind by the Laurentide ice sheet, gouged out of the bedrock and then filled with its meltwater. The fjords of Norway are the signature of the Fennoscandian, valleys carved by ice and then drowned by the sea. They were the greatest sculptors the world has ever known, and their medium was solid stone. All of this ice, kilometers thick, covering millions of square miles of the northern continents, had to come from somewhere. It was built from water evaporated from the world's oceans. So much water was vacuumed out of the seas and locked away in a solid state on land that global sea levels plummeted, not by a few feet, but by as much as 120 meters, or nearly 400 feet. Take a moment to truly visualize that. 400 feet, a 40-story building, the entire underwater continental shelf, that shallow fringe around our land masses, was exposed to the air. The world map was fundamentally redrawn. Coastlines were tens, even hundreds of miles farther out than they are today. The world was, in a sense, more connected. You could have walked from Siberia to Alaska, across a vast, dry plain. You could have strolled from mainland Europe to Great Britain. The English Channel was not a body of water, but a wide, low-lying river valley. Ireland was connected to Britain. The islands of Indonesia, Sumatra, Borneo, Java were not islands at all, but part of a single southeastern landmass called Sunda. New Guinea and Australia were joined as the continent of Sahul. The most famous of these now drowned landscapes is Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia and North America, but to call it a bridge is to do it a disservice. It wasn't a narrow, icy causeway. At its greatest extent, Beringia was a massive subcontinent, nearly 1,000 miles wide from north to south. It was a vast, sprawling, and for much of the Ice Age, largely ice-free landscape. It wasn't just a corridor, it was a destination, a place where plants grew and animals, and eventually people, lived for thousands of years. It was the original gateway to the New World, and it only existed because so much of the planet's water was piled up in frozen monuments to the sky, thousands of miles away. So we have this world with two massive ice caps in the north, grinding away at the land, and a redrawn map with lower oceans. But what was the rest of the world like? What was the climate, the feeling of this place? The word we associate with it is, of course, cold. But it was a different kind of cold than most of us have ever experienced. And it wasn't just cold, it was also incredibly dry. The vast ice sheets were so cold that they acted as colossal high-pressure zones, creating their own weather systems. They were so massive, they blocked the moisture-bearing winds from the oceans. The interiors of the continents, places like Central Europe, Siberia, and the American Midwest, received very little precipitation. They were, for all intents and purposes, cold deserts. And there was the wind. A feature of massive glaciers is something called a katabatic wind. The air directly above the endless expanse of ice becomes super chilled, dense, and heavy. Gravity then does its work, and this heavy air comes pouring off the edges of the ice sheets, flowing down onto the land below. These were not gentle breezes. They were relentless, ferociously cold, and dust-laden winds that scoured the landscape day in and day out. If you think a windy day in January is unpleasant, imagine a wind born on a 2-mile-high sheet of ice. It was a wind that could suck the heat out of any living thing with brutal efficiency. The seasons were also different. Winters were long, dark, and unimaginably severe, but the summers, though short, could be surprisingly intense. With the sun beating down for long hours on a dry landscape under clear skies, the brief summer could be a time of explosive growth, but it was fleeting. The dominant reality, the one that shaped every living thing, was the crushing, ever-present cold. It was the great antagonist of the Pleistocene. It wasn't just a temperature, it was a force, a creeping, insidious presence that seeped into every crack and crevice. It was the invisible enemy that wanted to steal your warmth, to slow your blood, to make you still. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The primary goal of every day was to not freeze solid overnight. You would think that such a world, cold, dry, windy, would be a barren wasteland, an empty expanse of frozen dirt, but you would be wrong. South of the great ice sheets, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France all the way across Eurasia and over Beringia into North America, lay the single largest biome on Earth. It has no perfect modern equivalent. We call it the Mammoth Steppe. It was not a forest. The cold and dryness prevented trees from growing in any significant numbers, save for a few hardy conifers and willows in sheltered river valleys. It was not a tundra, which is dominated by mosses and lichens, and it was not a prairie as we know it, with its tall, waving grasses. The Mammoth Steppe was a unique ecosystem, a vast, cold, arid grassland. Think of the plains of Wyoming, or the steppes of modern Siberia, but on an epic scale and supercharged. The ground was permanently frozen, permafrost, just a few feet below the surface. In the summer, the top layer would thaw into a muddy, boggy mess, but underneath, the ground was like iron. The landscape was dominated by a rich carpet of grasses, sedges, and hardy, protein-rich flowering plants called forbs. This wasn't the uniform green lawn of a modern pasture. It was a complex mosaic of vegetation, able to support a truly staggering number of animals. The air, as we mentioned, was filled with dust. The glaciers were constantly grinding rock into fine powder, and the relentless katabatic winds would pick this dust up and deposit it in thick layers across the steppe. This dust, called loess, is incredibly fertile. It was a constant natural fertilizer for the landscape, enriching the soil and fueling the growth of the plants that formed the base of the entire food web. The mammoth steppe was a world of pale greens and dusty yellows, stretching to an endless horizon under a vast pale blue sky, a world of immense open space. There was nowhere to hide, and you would need to hide, because this dry, grassy world supported a menagerie of animal life that beggars belief. It was a cold-weather Serengeti, teeming with giants, the megafauna. These are the creatures that truly define the Ice Age in our imagination, and for good reason. They were real, and our ancestors walked among them. The undisputed king of this landscape was, of course, the woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius. They were colossal. A large male could stand over 11 feet at the shoulder and weigh more than 6 tons. They were perfectly adapted to their environment. They had a thick layer of fat for insulation, and on top of that, a dense woolly undercoat, covered by a shaggy outer coat of long, coarse guard hairs, some of which could be 3 feet long. This was a coat that made the cold irrelevant. They had small, fur-lined ears and a short tail to minimize heat loss. Even their blood was special, with a type of hemoglobin that released oxygen at much colder temperatures than ours, keeping their extremities from freezing. Their most iconic feature, their massive curving tusks, weren't just for show. They could grow up to 15 feet long. They used them for defense against predators, for fighting other mammoths for dominance. But perhaps most importantly, they used them as snowplows. In the long winters, they would swing their heads back and forth, using their tusks to sweep away the deep snow and expose the dried grasses and sedges buried beneath. They were the great gardeners of the steppe, clearing the way for smaller herbivores to feed. They were social creatures, living in family groups led by an experienced matriarch, much like modern elephants. The sound of a herd of mammoths, their low, rumbling communications vibrating through the frozen ground, their thunderous footsteps, the sight of them against the setting sun, their hairy silhouettes dark against the ice-blue sky, must have been one of the most awe-inspiring spectacles in the history of this planet. Sharing the steppe with the mammoths was another woolly giant, the woolly rhinoceros, Colodonta antiquata. If the mammoth was a majestic social elephant, the woolly rhino was a grumpy, solitary, armored tank. It was covered in a thick, reddish-brown coat, and stood about 6.5 feet at the shoulder, weighing up to 3 tons. It was a pure grazer, with a wide, square snout perfect for munching on the low-lying steppe vegetation. Its most prominent feature was its massive front horn, which was not round like a modern rhino's, but flattened from side to side, like a giant paddle. It's believed they used this horn in the same way the mammoths used their tusks, as a personal snowplow, sweeping aside the snow to get to the food beneath. With its poor eyesight and famously bad temper, stumbling across a woolly rhino on the open steppe must have been a terrifying experience. A 3-ton battering ram of fur and fury. And where there are herbivores, there are carnivores. The apex predator of the European mammoth steppe was the cave lion, Panthera spelaea. The name is a bit of a misnomer. They didn't exclusively live in caves, though their bones are often found there. They were steppe hunters, and they were enormous, about 25% larger than a modern African lion, making them one of the largest cats that has ever lived. Fossilized paw prints show just how big they were. Unlike modern lions, the males almost certainly did not have manes. A mane is great for display on the hot savanna, but it would be a frozen, matted liability in an Ice Age winter. Cave paintings made by our ancestors depict them as sleek, powerful, and maneless. They hunted horses, reindeer, bison, and even the young of rhinos and mammoths. They were the silent, stalking death that moved through the frozen twilight, a constant, terrifying presence for any other living thing on the steppe, including the small, upright apes who were just beginning to make their mark. The landscape was also home to a creature of almost mythical beauty, the Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus. Again, the name is misleading. It wasn't an elk, and it wasn't exclusively Irish. It was a giant deer, the largest deer that ever lived. It stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, bigger than a moose, but its defining feature was its antlers. The males sported a set of antlers that could span up to 12 feet from tip to tip and weigh nearly 90 pounds. It is still a subject of scientific debate how they even managed to carry such a magnificent, absurd burden on their heads, let alone navigate through any kind of brush. These antlers were purely for display and for fighting other males during the rutting season. The sight of a herd of these giant deer moving across the plain, their colossal racks of bone held high, must have been simply breathtaking, a vision of impossible grandeur. The nights belonged to the howl of the wolf, but these were not the grey wolves we know today. These were dire wolves, Enochion dirus, particularly in North America, and their Eurasian counterparts. They were heavier and more robustly built than modern wolves, with a more powerful bite designed for crushing bone. They were pack hunters, built for endurance, able to run down prey over vast distances. They were the clean-up crew and the relentless pursuers of the Ice Age world, their calls a constant chilling reminder that you were never truly alone on the vast empty plains. And the list goes on. There were herds of steppe bison, much larger and with longer horns than their modern American cousins. There were wild horses, the ancestors of today's domestic horse, sturdy and tough. In the more sheltered areas you might find muskox, with their uniquely defensive circular formations. There were cave bears, enormous herbivores that despite their diet, you would not want to disturb during their hibernation. And in North America, the predator list was even more terrifying, with saber-toothed cats, like Smilodon, with their terrifying dental daggers, and the giant short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, a beast that could stand 12 feet tall on its hind legs, and was built like a sprinter. It was perhaps the most formidable mammalian land predator ever to exist. This was the world, a world of cosmic rhythms that dictated the coming and going of ice, a world where the land itself was crushed and reshaped by frozen rivers, moving at a geological pace, a world where the very oceans were diminished, revealing new lands and new connections, a world dominated by a climate of extremes, a dry, windy and profound cold that was punctuated by brief, explosive summers, and it was a world populated by giants, a spectacle of megafauna that seems more like a fantasy epic than natural history. This is the stage, this vast, intimidating and magnificent world of the mammoth steppe, stretching out under the shadow of the great ice sheets. It is a world that seems utterly alien, utterly inhospitable to a small, fragile, tropical ape that had only recently walked out of Africa. It's a world that should have broken us, a world that should have sent us scurrying back to the warm lands we came from, but it didn't. Because into this world of ice and wind and giants walked our ancestors. They didn't have thick fur, or massive horns, or bone-crushing jaws. They had their hands, their minds, and a stubborn, burning spark of ingenuity. They looked at this frozen landscape, not just as a terrifying threat, but as a challenge, and as an opportunity. They learned to read the seasons, to follow the great herds, to find shelter in the unforgiving land. They learned to master fire, the captured sun that could hold the terrible cold at bay. They learned to turn the skins of the beasts into clothing, the bones into tools, and the tusks into art. This frozen world was the crucible that forged us. It was the great filter that shaped our evolution, that honed our intelligence, that demanded cooperation and communication. Surviving here wasn't just about staying warm. It was about outthinking the cold itself. It was about understanding the world on a deeper level than any creature had before. The story of human survival in the Ice Age is therefore not just a story of enduring hardship. It is the story of how we became who we are. It's the very beginning of our journey to becoming the masters of this planet. And it all started here, as a handful of people, huddled around a flickering fire, listening to the wind howl and the mammoths roar, on a planet of ice. Chapter 2. The Family Tree. A parade of predecessors. But those people, huddled around that flickering light on a planet of ice, who were they, really? It's tempting to picture them as people just like us, only dressed in furs, and with a much more pressing need to worry about the weekly mammoth forecast. And in many ways they were Homo sapiens, our direct one-to-one ancestors. But to say the story of human survival begins with them is like starting a magnificent, sprawling novel on the very last chapter. You'd get the ending, sure, but you would miss the entire epic journey that made that ending possible. Our species didn't just appear out of nowhere, fully formed and ready to take on a frozen world. We are the inheritors of a legacy so ancient it makes the pyramids look like they were built yesterday. We carry within our very bones, in the code of our DNA, the echoes of countless generations of beings who came before us. They were our ancestors, our cousins, a long, often strange and absolutely remarkable parade of hominins who walked the earth for millions of years, each one adding a new trick, a new adaptation, a new idea to the growing toolkit of what it meant to be human. So, before we settle in with our own direct line, let's take a quiet journey back. Let's dim the lights and travel deeper into the past the great ice sheets, past the familiar landscapes, to meet the rest of the family. Because to understand how we survived the Ice Age, we first need to understand the incredible foundation that was laid for us, stone by stone, fire by fire, by a cast of characters who were, in their own time, the absolute pinnacle of existence. Our journey begins not in a frozen tundra, but under the warm sun of Africa, a few million years ago, and the first relative we're going to meet is a rather unassuming character. They weren't particularly big or strong. They stood maybe 4 feet tall, slight of build, with long arms that still spoke of a life spent partially in the trees, in the grand theatre of the African savannah, filled with saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and all manner of terrifyingly large predators. They were hardly the main attraction. They were, to be blunt, potential prey. But they had an idea, a spark of genius that would change the course of life on this planet forever. We call them Homo habilis, which translates quite beautifully to handyman. Now, the idea itself sounds almost comically simple to us. Homo habilis looked at one rock, and then looked at another rock, and had the brilliant, world-altering thought to smash them together, not out of anger, not by accident, but with purpose, with intent. They learned that if you strike a certain kind of stone, like flint or chert, in just the right way, you can flake off a piece, leaving behind a core with a razor-sharp edge. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just using a thing that was already there, like a chimp using a stick to get termites. This was manufacturing. It was seeing a tool hidden inside a raw material. It was the birth of technology, that sharp-edged flake, and the core it came from formed what we call the Oldowan toolkit. It was the first entry in the human instruction manual. It was technology 1.0. To our eyes, it's just a sharp rock. We live in a world of microchips and satellites, and we're looking at something you could mistake for simple gravel. But for a small, vulnerable hominin on the African savannah, that sharp rock was everything. It was a key that unlocked a whole new world of food. Before this, if you found a carcass of an animal left behind by a lion, you were out of luck. You couldn't tear through that thick hide with your bare hands and blunt teeth. But with a stone chopper, suddenly, you could butcher it. You could slice through skin and sinew, getting at the calorie-rich meat and organs inside. And they had another trick. They could use a hammerstone to smash open the long bones, the femurs and tibias, to get at the marrow. This stuff is one of the most calorie-dense foods in nature, a fatty, rich superfood. For a creature with a growing brain, and brains are incredibly greedy for energy, marrow was rocket fuel. Homo habilis wasn't a mighty hunter, stalking mammoths across the plains. They were, most likely, expert scavengers. They lived in the margins, letting the big predators do the hard work, then darting in when it was safe to grab what they could. They were clever opportunists, and their simple stone tools were their ticket to a better life. It was the difference between starving and surviving. Imagine the world from their perspective, a world of constant, low-grade anxiety. Every rustle in the tall grass could be the end. The nights were long and terrifyingly dark, filled with the sounds of things that saw you as a meal. You lived in a small, tight-knit group, because your only real defense was each other. You had to communicate, to cooperate. You had to watch, and listen, and learn. And in the middle of all that vulnerability, you held in your hand a piece of the earth that you had shaped, a tool. It was a pathetic defense against a lion, perhaps, but it was a powerful statement of intent. It was a declaration that you were not just going to be a passive victim of your environment. You were going to start shaping it to your will. Even if for now that just meant getting the last bits of meat off a dead gazelle. Every great journey starts with a single step, and for humanity, that first step was a piece of sharpened stone. For about 1 million years, this was the state of the art. The Oldowan chopper was the must-have gadget, but evolution never stands still. The family tree kept growing, branching out, and the next character to step onto the stage was a real game-changer. They were taller, stronger, with a brain significantly larger than that of habilis. They walked fully upright, with a stride much like our own. We call them Homo erectus, the upright man. And if habilis was the one who wrote the first line of code for humanity, Erectus was the one who used it to build the first functioning app. And then, they took that app global. Homo erectus wasn't content to just live in the margins. They took the basic idea of the stone tool and refined it. They created something truly remarkable, a tool so successful and so iconic that it would remain in use, in one form or another, for over 1 million years. It's called the Acheulean hand axe. Unlike the simple Oldowan chopper, the hand axe was a work of art. It was a teardrop-shaped, symmetrical, beautifully crafted object. It was worked on both sides, flaked carefully to produce a sharp, continuous edge. It fit perfectly in the palm of your hand. This wasn't just a tool, it was a concept. To make one, you couldn't just smash two rocks together. You had to have a mental blueprint of the final product in your mind before you even started. You had to plan your strikes, to think in 3 dimensions, to patiently and skillfully shape the stone. This suggests a mind that was becoming more complex, more capable of abstract thought. The hand axe was the Swiss Army knife of the Paleolithic. You could use it to butcher animals, to scrape hides, to dig for roots and tubers, to chop wood. It was an all-purpose tool for a new, more ambitious kind of human. And with this new toolkit, Homo erectus began to do something that no hominin had ever done before. They started to walk. And I don't mean they just walked around their neighborhood. They walked out of Africa. This was the first great human migration, a slow, inexorable expansion across the globe that took place over tens of thousands of generations. They didn't have a destination in mind. There was no grand plan, no map, no compass. They likely just followed the herds of animals, explored the next valley, crossed the next river. Generation by generation, they spread, north into the Middle East, east across Asia, reaching as far as China and Indonesia, and west into Europe. For the first time, a human ancestor was colonizing the planet. They adapted to new climates, new foods, new challenges. They were the original pioneers. And they had a powerful new ally in their travels, an ally that would fundamentally change our relationship with the world forever. They captured and tamed the most powerful and terrifying force in nature, fire. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend a world without controlled fire. We are so used to warmth and light at the flick of a switch, but for our ancestors, the world was dictated by the sun. When it set, a profound and dangerous darkness fell. The cold crept in. Predators, many of whom had excellent night vision, had the advantage. Night was a time of fear. We don't know exactly how they first learned to control it. Perhaps they captured it from a natural wildfire, carefully tending a burning branch and keeping it alive. The ability to make fire at will likely came much, much later, but however they did it, harnessing fire changed everything. First, there was warmth. For a species that evolved in Africa, moving into the colder climes of Europe and Asia was a serious challenge. Fire provided a portable source of heat, a central hearth that could keep the deadly chill at bay. It made previously uninhabitable lands livable. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. Second, there was safety. A crackling fire is a powerful deterrent. Most animals are instinctively afraid of it. A group of hominins huddled around a fire was an island of relative safety in a sea of nocturnal predators. The flickering light pushed back the terrifying darkness and its unseen dangers. And third, and perhaps most importantly, there was cooking. Cooking is a form of pre-digestion. It breaks down tough fibers and complex proteins, making food easier to chew and digest. This means you get far more energy out of the same amount of food. It also kills parasites and bacteria, making food safer to eat. This dietary revolution, this sudden influx of easily accessible calories, likely had a profound effect on our evolution. It provided the fuel needed to power an even larger, more complex brain. But fire did something else too. It created a social center. The hearth became the first living room. It was a place to gather at the end of the day, to share food, to be close to one another. It was a source of light that extended the day, allowing for more time to work on tools, to interact, to maybe even share stories. It was around the fire that we truly began to become social, cultural beings. The flickering flames weren't just holding back the cold and the predators, they were illuminating the very beginnings of human society. So here we have Homo erectus, this tall, resourceful wanderer, armed with a sophisticated hand axe and the power of fire, striding confidently across the globe. They were a staggering success story, dominating the planet for well over 1 million years. To put that in perspective, our own species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for about 300,000 years. They were the old masters, but the story doesn't end with them. The family tree continued to branch, and as erectus populations spread out and became isolated, they began to evolve in different directions, adapting to their new local environments. And this brings us to one of our most famous and most misunderstood relatives. In the cold, challenging landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, a new kind of human emerged. They were shorter, more robust, and powerfully built. They had a distinctive brow ridge, a large nose, and a brain that was on average even slightly larger than our own today. We know them as the Neanderthals. For a long time, the popular image of the Neanderthal was that of a brutish, hunched-over, dim-witted caveman, a sort of evolutionary dead end, a clumsy failure who was quickly swept aside by the arrival of the much more sophisticated and intelligent Homo sapiens. This caricature, we now know, is profoundly wrong. The Neanderthals were not failures. They were the original Ice Age survival experts. They thrived in a harsh, unforgiving world for hundreds of thousands of years, a testament to their incredible resilience and intelligence. Their bodies were a masterclass in adaptation to the cold. That stocky, barrel-chested build was perfect for conserving heat, a much better shape for a cold climate than our own lanky, tropically adapted frames. Their large noses may have helped to warm and humidify the frigid, dry air before it hit their lungs. They were immensely strong, with bones far thicker than ours, and they needed to be, because of the way they lived. If you want to understand Neanderthals, you have to understand the hunt. They were apex predators, specializing in taking down the giant beasts of the Ice Age, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant cave bears, but they didn't have long-range projectile weapons like bows and arrows. Their toolkit, called the Mysterian, was an advancement on the old hand axe, featuring a variety of more specialized flake tools, scrapers, points, and blades. Their primary hunting weapons were heavy, stone-tipped thrusting spears. This means that to kill a woolly rhino, you couldn't stand back and throw something at it from a safe distance. You had to get up close, uncomfortably close. You had to get within arm's length of a multi-ton animal that was very, very unhappy to see you, and thrust your spear into it. It was a terrifyingly dangerous way to make a living, and we see the evidence of this lifestyle written on their bones. When paleoanthropologists examine Neanderthal skeletons, they find a distinct pattern of injuries, a huge number of healed fractures, especially to the head, neck, and upper body. It's a pattern of trauma that is remarkably similar to one modern group of people, professional rodeo riders. These were people who were regularly getting thrown around and trampled by very large, very angry animals. It was a hard, brutal life, but they were incredibly good at it. They weren't just surviving in the Ice Age, they were masters of it. But were they just brutish survival machines? Or was there something more going on in those large brains? For a long time it was thought that things like art, symbolism, and religion were the exclusive domain of Homo sapiens. But the more we discover about Neanderthals, the more that line begins to blur. We have found Neanderthal sites where it appears they deliberately buried their dead. This might sound simple, but it's a profound act. It implies they had some concept of death, some feeling for their lost companions that went beyond just leaving them for the scavengers. At some sites there is even debated evidence that they buried their dead with grave goods, like tools or animal bones, or even flowers. We know they used pigments like black manganese and red ochre. Were they painting their bodies for rituals? Were they creating art on cave walls or animal skins that has long since faded away? We have found eagle talons that were notched and polished, very likely worn as pendants or ornaments. We found strange collections of fossils and minerals at their sites that they seem to have gathered for no practical purpose, perhaps just because they found them beautiful or interesting. None of this is definitive proof of a rich, symbolic inner life, on par with our own, but it strongly suggests that the old image of the thoughtless brute is wrong. They cared for their sick and elderly, We have found skeletons of old Neanderthals with debilitating injuries who could not possibly have survived for years without the help of their group. They were intelligent, resourceful, and deeply social creatures with complex lives that we are only just beginning to appreciate. They were not some lesser transitional form. They were a different kind of human, successful and complete in their own right. And they were not alone. While the Neanderthals were ruling Ice Age Europe, another, far more mysterious branch of the human family was living in Asia. We call them the Denisovans. The story of the Denisovans is a perfect example of how much our understanding of the past is changing. They are a ghost lineage. For decades we had no idea they even existed. Then, in 2010, scientists in a cave called Denisova in Siberia were analysing a tiny fragment of a finger bone. It was so small they couldn't even tell what kind of hominin it belonged to, but they managed to extract ancient DNA from it, and when they sequenced that DNA, they got a shock. It didn't match modern humans, and it didn't match Neanderthals. It was something entirely new. Since then, we found a few more scraps, a couple of teeth, a piece of a jawbone, and that's it. That is almost the entire physical record of the Denisovans. And yet from their DNA we can tell an incredible story. We know they were a sister group to the Neanderthals, their ancestors having split from the Neanderthal line a few 100,000 years earlier. We know they lived all across Asia, from the freezing mountains of Siberia and Tibet down to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. And we know one more, absolutely astonishing thing. They met our ancestors. Because here is where the story gets really interesting. For a very long time, the planet was a much more human place than it is today. As our own species, Homo sapiens finally began to expand out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. We were the newcomers, the new kids on the block. And as we moved into Europe and Asia, we found that they were already occupied. The Neanderthals were there, the Denisovans were there, and maybe other, undiscovered types of humans were there too. For thousands of years, multiple intelligent human species shared the same world. What happened when they met? Did they fight? Did they avoid each other? Did they trade? The answer, it turns out, is yes to all of the above, and something more. They had families together. The proof is inside you right now. If your ancestry is from outside of Africa, you have somewhere between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in your genome. It's a direct living legacy of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Certain genes we inherited from them seem to be related to the immune system, to hair and skin characteristics, traits that may have helped our African ancestors adapt more quickly to the new diseases and colder, less sunny climates of Eurasia. It was a genetic gift from the old-timers. The Denisovan legacy is there too, especially in populations in Melanesia, Australia and the Philippines. People can have up to 6% Denisovan DNA. One particular gene inherited from Denisovans helps modern Tibetans live at high altitudes, a remarkable echo of an ancient adaptation. So the neat linear story of human evolution, one species neatly replacing the next, is wrong. It was a much messier, more complicated, and far more interesting story. It wasn't a ladder, it was a tangled bush, a braided stream. For a while the world was home to a human mosaic, and the eventual success of Homo sapiens wasn't just about us being better, it was a complex story of climate change, competition, and crucially, absorption. We didn't just replace them. In a very real sense, they became part of us. Their stories, their adaptations, their very biology did not vanish from the earth. They live on, in small but significant ways, in the billions of humans walking the planet today. This is the incredible inheritance that our Ice Age ancestors carried with them. They were not a blank slate. They were the product of millions of years of evolution, a journey that started with a simple stone chopper in the hands of a small, clever scavenger, a journey that saw our ancestors tame fire, craft tools of incredible beauty and utility, and spread across the entire globe. A journey that saw our family tree branch out into a fascinating diversity of forms, each one a unique experiment in how to be human. When a Homo sapiens hunter in Ice Age Europe crafted a spear point, the ghost of a Neanderthal who had hunted the same prey in the same valley stood beside him. When a family huddled around a fire for warmth against the howling wind, they were reenacting a scene that had played out for 1,000,000 years, a tradition passed down from their Homo erectus ancestors. and when their bodies fought off a local disease, they may well have been thanking a sliver of DNA gifted to them from an ancient and forgotten tryst in a world we can barely imagine. They were the inheritors of it all, the grit, the ingenuity, the resilience and the complex genetic legacy of this entire parade of predecessors. And armed with this deep and ancient history, they were now ready to face the greatest challenge of all, the frozen, hostile and magnificent world of the Upper Paleolithic. They were ready to take that inheritance and build something entirely new upon it. Chapter 3. The Trinity of Survival: Fire, Shelter, and Stone. And the first block in that new foundation wasn't a block at all. It was a flicker. It was a dance of orange and yellow against the oppressive, endless dark. Before we can talk about the great hunts or the painted caves, before we can even begin to understand the complex social worlds they were building, we have to sit with them in the cold for a moment and appreciate the single greatest technological leap in the history of life on this planet: the taming of fire. It's almost impossible for us, in our world of light switches and central heating, to truly comprehend a world without it. We have so thoroughly vanquished the night that we have to actively seek it out, driving to dark sky parks to remember what the universe actually looks like. For our Ice Age ancestors, the darkness wasn't a novelty, it was a presence. It was a predator in its own right, a vast cold entity that owned half of their lives. The setting of the sun wasn't a signal to turn on the television, it was a curtain falling on the world, a signal to huddle together in raw animal fear and pray for the dawn. The cold was its partner in crime, a relentless seeping thing that worked its way into your bones. Forget about arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. Without fire, warmth was a fleeting commodity. It was the body heat of your family, the temporary shelter of a thick hide, or the brief, inadequate blessing of a patch of sun on a clear day. But the cold always won. It waited patiently, and it always found a way back in. And the food. Oh, the food. We are a species that has forgotten the sheer grinding effort of chewing. Everything they ate was raw, tough, sinewy muscle from a scavenged carcass, fibrous roots dug from the frozen ground. Not only was it a workout for the jaw, it was also a biological gamble. Raw meat is a playground for bacteria and parasites. Every meal was a roll of the dice with your digestive system. It was filling, yes, but so much of the potential energy in that food was locked away, inaccessible to their bodies. This was the baseline reality. A cold, dark world filled with things that could see better in the night than you, filled with food that fought back even after it was dead. And into this reality something new arrived. Perhaps it was a gift from the sky, a lightning strike that set a dead tree ablaze. You can imagine the scene, the terror, at first, this roaring, consuming monster that eats the forest. But also curiosity. As the initial fear subsides, a brave or perhaps foolish soul inches closer. They feel its warmth pushing back the biting cold. They see how it illuminates the trees, turning familiar shapes into a flickering, dancing world. They notice that the wolves and the hyenas, usually so bold at the edge of the shadows, keep their distance. This thing, this terrifying, beautiful thing, has power. Getting from that initial awe to actual control was a journey that likely took hundreds of thousands of years. The first step was probably just opportunistic, keeping an ember from a natural fire alive, tending it, feeding it small sticks, learning its appetite. The role of firekeeper would have been one of the most vital, most stressful jobs in the ancient world. If you think your Wi-Fi going out is a disaster, imagine being the one who let the clan's only source of heat, light and protection die out. The pressure would have been immense. The little clay pot or hollowed horn carrying those precious glowing embers was the most important piece of technology they owned. It was their lifeline. The next leap, the true taming, was learning to make it from scratch. The magic of percussion, striking a piece of pyrite against flint to shower sparks onto a bed of tinder, or the patient, meditative work of friction, a wooden spindle spun tirelessly in a notch on a fireboard until a wisp of smoke signals the birth of a tiny glowing coal. This was true mastery. This was the moment humanity stopped being a victim of the cold and dark and started to dictate its own terms. We could now carry the sun in our pockets. We could make a summer's day in the heart of a blizzard. And with that control, everything changed. The revolution of fire wasn't just one thing. It was a cascade of transformations that remade our species from the inside out. First, the obvious: warmth. The hearth became the center of life. It was a bubble of artificial warmth in a world of profound cold. It meant you could survive in latitudes that were previously unthinkable. It meant you could venture deeper into the winter, knowing you had a sanctuary to return to. The simple act of holding your hands out to a flame, of feeling return to numb fingers and toes, is a primal comfort we can still understand today. For them, it was the daily miracle that made life possible. The cold was still out there, howling at the entrance to the cave, but inside the circle of firelight, humanity had its own miniature sun. Then there was light. The fire pushed back the physical darkness, extending the usable day. Activities that once had to cease at sunset, tool-making, preparing hides, socializing, could now continue into the evening. But it also pushed back a more profound psychological darkness. The night was no longer the sole domain of the cave lion and the saber-tooth. That ring of fire was a protective wall, a magical barrier that predators were deeply, instinctively afraid of. It gave our ancestors a sense of security, a confidence in the dark that was entirely new. It was within this circle of light, listening to the crackle and pop of the flames, that the first great stories were likely told. It was the birth of the living room. It was the first television, with a show that was always mesmerizing and always new. This is where culture was forged, in the shared space created by the light. And perhaps most profoundly, fire gave us the kitchen. The application of heat to food was as significant as the discovery of fire itself. We call it cooking. Anthropologists sometimes call it creating an external stomach. By cooking meat and plants, you are essentially pre-digesting them. The heat breaks down tough fibers and complex proteins that our own stomachs struggle with. It unlocks a treasure trove of calories and nutrients that were previously unavailable. A cooked piece of mammoth steak delivered far more energy than a raw one, for far less effort. Cooking also kills parasites and bacteria, making food safer and reducing the constant grinding toll of disease. This dietary shift had a direct and dramatic impact on our own evolution. With more energy available from our food, our bodies could afford to make a trade-off. Our digestive tracts, which had to be large and energy-intensive to process raw food, began to shrink, and all of that surplus energy was redirected to the most demanding, most power-hungry organ in our bodies, the brain. We literally cooked our way to bigger brains. The hearth was not just a fireplace, it was an engine of cognitive growth. The smells of that first barbecue must have been intoxicating. The sizzle of fat dripping into the flames, the aroma of roasting meat filling the air. It would have drawn everyone together, a powerful social glue. Sharing cooked food is a universal human act of communion, and its roots are right here, around a smoky fire at the dawn of our consciousness. Fire even became a tool in its own right. A burning branch could be used to drive a predator from a cave, or to flush game from thick brush. And they quickly learned that if you carefully charred the tip of a wooden spear in the embers, it became incredibly hard and sharp, a process called fire hardening. The fire wasn't just a comfort, it was a weapon and a workshop. It was the first pillar of their new world. This flickering, hungry, beautiful thing that they had stolen from the gods and made their own. It gave them warmth, light, safety, and the very fuel for the minds that would allow them to conquer a planet. But a fire in the open is at the mercy of the wind and the rain. This new heart of the human world needed a body to protect it. It needed a home, and so we turned to the second pillar of survival, shelter. For tens of thousands of years, the best real estate on the market was a cave. It was the original turnkey home, solid rock walls, a roof that didn't leak most of the time. It offered a natural defense against the elements, and a clear vantage point to watch for both predators and prey. Finding a good south-facing cave, one that would catch the low winter sun with a source of water nearby, was like winning the Paleolithic lottery. But this prime real estate often came with existing tenants, and these weren't the kind of neighbours you could ask to keep the noise down. We're talking about cave bears, colossal beasts that could weigh over 1,000 pounds, or cave lions, larger and more formidable than their modern African relatives. Claiming a cave often meant forcibly evicting a top predator, an act of incredible bravery and strategic cooperation. It would have been a high-stakes home invasion, a desperate battle fought with fire-hardened spears and stones in the echoing dark. The archaeological record is filled with caves that show alternating layers of human and predator occupation, a silent testament to a long and brutal turf war for the best homes on the block. Life inside a cave was a multi-sensory experience. The air would be thick with the smoke from the hearth, a constant haze that would sting the eyes and coat the walls in a layer of black soot. Away from the entrance and the fire, the darkness was absolute, a heavy, silent black that swallowed all light. The acoustics would be strange, with voices and the crackling of the fire echoing off the damp stone walls. And the smell, a rich, earthy cocktail of wood smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, scraped hides, and the faint, persistent odor of damp rock and mildew. It wasn't pleasant by our standards, but it was the smell of home. It was the smell of safety. The floor would be packed earth, cold and unforgiving. Animal hides would be spread out for seating and sleeping, but the damp chill would always be there, creeping up from below. They lived their lives in layers, layers of clothing, layers of hides on the floor, and layers of their own history accumulating beneath their feet. Over generations, the floor of a cave would rise, built up from discarded bones, lost tools, ashes from the fire, and the general detritus of daily life. For archaeologists, this is a gift. Each layer is a page in a history book, a snapshot of a moment in time. For the people living there, it was just the floor. But not everyone was lucky enough to find a cave. Much of the vast, open tundra of Ice Age Eurasia was flat, windswept, and utterly devoid of natural shelters. Here, if you wanted a home, you had to build it. And this is where we see some of the most breathtaking ingenuity of our ancient ancestors. They became architects of the Ice Age, and their primary building material was the most impressive resource the tundra had to offer, the mammoth. In places like Migirich in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists have unearthed the remains of incredible structures, dwellings built almost entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. These weren't just crude lean-tos. These were planned, sophisticated pieces of architecture. They were the suburban homes of the Paleolithic. Imagine the construction site. The foundation would be laid first, a circle of heavy mammoth skulls and lower jaws, dug slightly into the permafrost to provide a solid base. These weren't just random piles. They were often arranged in deliberate decorative patterns. One famous hut has a line of jawbones set on their ends, creating a striking herringbone effect. This wasn't just about function. There was an aesthetic at work here, a sense of pride in their home. From this foundation they would build the framework. They would take the massive curving tusks of the mammoths and set them upright, interlocking them at the top to create a high, domed roof. The ribs and leg bones would be used to fill in the walls, creating a strong, lattice-like structure. This was the Paleolithic equivalent of timber framing. It required immense strength, cooperation, and a deep understanding of practical engineering. How do you lift a 200-pound tusk into place? How do you lash it securely with strips of animal sinew so it can withstand a 90-mile-per-hour blizzard? This was knowledge honed over generations. Once the bone frame was complete, it needed a skin. This would be provided by dozens of mammoth hides, painstakingly scraped clean, stitched together with bone needles and sinew thread, and then stretched taut over the skeleton. The sheer scale of this is hard to fathom. A single mammoth hide could weigh hundreds of pounds. Preparing it was a monumental task. Covering a hut 10 or 15 feet in diameter would have required the hides from numerous animals, representing a huge investment of hunting and processing effort. Finally, the whole structure would be chinked with moss and mud, and likely covered with blocks of sod cut from the frozen earth to provide extra insulation. The entrance was often framed with the most impressive tusks, a grand and intimidating doorway. Sometimes they would even build a long, low entrance tunnel, also made of bone, to act as a windbreak, a prehistoric mudroom to keep the worst of the cold out of the main living space. Step inside one of these homes. Outside, the wind is a physical force, a constant shrieking assault that drives the snow horizontally across a landscape of endless white. The temperature is 40 below zero, but inside, it's a different world. It's dim, lit by the flickering orange glow of a central hearth, and perhaps a few simple stone lamps, hollowed-out stones filled with animal fat, with a moss wick. The air is thick with smoke, which finds its way out through a small hole left at the apex of the roof. It is cramped and crowded, filled with the members of an extended family. People are sleeping on raised platforms covered in soft furs from Arctic foxes and wolves. Someone is chipping away at a piece of flint in the corner. The sharp tick, 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 a familiar rhythm of daily life. The smell is overwhelming. The same mix of smoke, bodies and cooking, but with the added powerful scent of leather and old bone. But it is warm. The combination of the thick hide and sod roof, the body heat of a dozen people, and the precious fire in the centre has created a pocket of life in the midst of a frozen deathscape. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a declaration. It was a statement that we are here, we are smart, and we will not be defeated by this world. We will take the bones of the biggest thing that walks this earth, and we will build our home from them. Fire gave them a heart, shelter gave that heart a body, but neither of these would have been possible without the hands to build them. And those hands were guided by a technology so fundamental, so ancient, that we often forget to even call it technology. This was the bedrock upon which everything else was built, the oldest and most enduring conversation between humanity and the physical world. It is the third pillar of survival, stone. For over 3 million years, long before our own species even existed, our ancestors had been shaping stone to their will. It was our first invention, our first art form, our first weapon. The entire vast sweep of this era is named for it, the Stone Age. And the story of the Stone Age is the story of a mind learning to see the potential hidden inside a rock. It's a slow-motion arms race, not against an enemy, but against the limitations of our own bodies. Let's travel back to the very beginning. The first stone tools, what we call the Oldowan industry, were deceptively simple. You take a smooth, fist-sized river cobble, the core, and you strike it hard with another rock, the hammerstone. If you get the angle just right, a flake of stone shears off, leaving behind a sharp, jagged edge on the core. Congratulations, you've just made a chopper. It's crude, it's basic, but it is a revolutionary piece of equipment. That simple, sharp edge can do things your teeth and fingernails cannot. It can slice through the thick hide of a dead animal to get at the meat inside. It can be used to smash open a long bone to get at the rich, calorie-dense marrow. It can sharpen a stick into a rudimentary spear. The Oldowan toolmaker wasn't necessarily creating a specific shape. They were creating an edge. The goal was function, pure and simple. It was the discovery that a rock could be more than just a rock. It could be a key to unlocking the world's resources. For nearly 1 million years, this was the state of the art. But then, a new idea emerged. A new design that was so successful, it would dominate the human toolkit for another 1 million years after that. This was the Herculean hand axe. The hand axe is a different beast entirely. It's not just a broken rock, it is a shaped object, typically teardrop or pear-shaped. It has been worked carefully on both sides, what we call bifacial, to create a continuous cutting edge all the way around, culminating in a sharp point. This wasn't the result of a single lucky strike. Making a hand axe required dozens, sometimes hundreds of precise blows. It required planning. The toolmaker had to have a mental template, an image in their mind of the finished product, and they had to know the precise sequence of strikes needed to get there. This is a cognitive leap. It's the difference between accidentally making something useful and deliberately creating a standardized, preconceived form. The Herculean hand axe was the Swiss army knife of the Paleolithic. You could use the point to dig, the long edges to slice and chop, and the rounded butt end to hammer. It was an all-purpose tool, perfectly balanced, that fit comfortably in the palm of the hand. And they were often beautiful. Archaeologists find hand axes made from stunning pieces of striped flint or translucent quartzite, worked far beyond the point of mere functionality, into objects of clear symmetry and aesthetic appeal. Some are found in pristine condition, having never been used. It's led some to believe they were more than just tools. Perhaps they were a social signal, a display of skill and intelligence. Look at the fine axe I can make. I am a capable provider, a worthy mate. In a world with few material possessions, the quality of your toolkit said everything about you. The next great innovation came from our cousins, the Neanderthals. Their toolkit, the Mysterian, was based on a technique of profound cleverness, known as the Levallois, or prepared core technique. Imagine you're an Herculean toolmaker. You take a big rock and you chip away at it until the rock itself becomes the tool. The hand axe, a lot of the original rock is wasted in the process. A Neanderthal using the levolor technique did the opposite. They didn't care about the core. They cared about the flakes. They would take a large flint nodule and meticulously pre-shape it, like a sculptor preparing a block of marble. They would chip away at the edges, creating a specific domed shape, like a turtle shell. Then they would prepare a striking platform at one end. All of this work, all this preparation, was leading up to a single, final, decisive blow. They would strike that platform with perfect precision, and a large, thin, perfectly shaped flake would shear off the face of the core. That flake was the tool. It was sharp, it was standardized, and it was ready to be used as a spear point or a scraper with minimal extra work. This is abstract thought of a very high order. You are planning 10 steps ahead. You're not just shaping a tool, you're shaping a rock that will produce a tool. It's incredibly efficient. From a single prepared core, a skilled Neanderthal could produce multiple, high-quality flakes, getting far more cutting edge out of a piece of flint than their predecessors. It was the invention of mass production. It speaks volumes about the intelligence and foresight of the Neanderthals, a species for too long dismissed as brutish and simple. Their tools tell a different story. They tell a story of quiet, methodical genius. And then, with the arrival of our own species, Homo sapiens, in the Upper Paleolithic, tool technology explodes in a frenzy of creativity and innovation. The new hallmark technique was the production of blades. A blade, by archaeological definition, is a flake that is at least twice as long as it is wide, and Upper Paleolithic people mastered a way to produce them in incredible quantities. They would start with a large cylindrical core of high-quality flint, using a hammer made of antler or bone, a soft hammer which gives more control than a stone one. They would strike the edge of the core, and a long, thin, razor-sharp blade would peel off, almost like slicing a sliver from a loaf of bread. A skilled napper could walk around the core, striking off dozens of nearly identical blades. This was revolutionary. The amount of usable cutting edge they could get from a single pound of flint skyrocketed. It was the ultimate in efficiency. But the real genius was what they did with these blades. These weren't the final tool. They were blanks. They were the raw material for an entire new universe of specialized implements. That simple blade could be retouched, its edges finely chipped to become a knife for butchering. It could be snapped into sections to make sharp barbs for a harpoon. The end could be shaped into a chisel-like edge to create a tool called a burin, which was used for engraving bone, antler, and ivory. They created end scrapers for cleaning hides, awls for punching holes in leather, and drills for making beads. The toolkit became a toolbox, filled with specialized instruments for every conceivable task. If the Acheulean hand axe was a Swiss army knife, the Upper Paleolithic toolkit was a surgeon's tray. And this specialization led to the single most important military and hunting innovation of the age, effective projectile points. For the first time, stone points were made that were light enough, sharp enough, and aerodynamic enough to be attached to the end of a spear and thrown with lethal accuracy. This changed the hunt completely. You no longer had to run up to a 2-ton woolly rhino and poke it with a sharpened stick, a tactic that is, to use a technical term, a very bad idea. You could now engage from a safe distance. They even invented a force multiplier, a piece of technology that seems simple to us, but was a quantum leap in physics for them, the adlatl, or spear thrower. It's essentially a short stick with a hook or a spur at the end that cradles the back of the spear. When you throw the spear using the adlatl, it acts as an extension of your arm, dramatically increasing the leverage and the amount of energy you can transfer to the projectile. A spear thrown with an adlatl can travel faster, farther, and with 3 times the kinetic energy of one thrown by hand. It turned a simple spear into a deadly armor-piercing missile. This was the technology that allowed them to consistently hunt the megafauna of the Ice Age, the mammoths, the bison, the giant elk. It was a game-changer that tilted the balance of power firmly in favor of these small, clever apes. Underpinning all of this, the fire, the shelters, the tools, was the most important element of all, knowledge. None of this was instinct. A human child is not born knowing how to knap flint or build a mammoth hut. This was all learned behavior, culture. It was a vast and complex body of knowledge that had to be painstakingly passed down from one generation to the next. Imagine a young boy sitting by the fire watching his father or his uncle work a piece of flint. He's watching the angle of the blows, the way the napper turns the core in his hands, listening to the sound the stone makes. He learns to see the subtle ripple lines in the rock that tell you which way the force will travel. He starts with a simple hammerstone, just learning to knock off clumsy flakes. He will ruin hundreds of pieces of flint. His hands will be cut and calloused, but over years of practice, of patient instruction, his hands will learn the language of the stone. The muscle memory will become so deeply ingrained that he can do it by feel, by sound, almost without thinking. A young girl learns from her mother how to scrape a hide without tearing it, using a specific type of stone scraper. She learns which plants produce the best cordage for sewing, which sinew is the strongest. She learns how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find the North Star, which mushrooms will feed you and which will kill you. This was their education. There were no books, no classrooms. There was only observation, imitation, and practice. This generational transfer of information, this living library of survival skills, was the invisible thread that held their entire world together. It was the quiet, constant work that made the Trinity of fire, shelter, and stone possible. They were no longer just surviving the Ice Age. They were mastering it. They had the warmth of the fire, the security of a well-built home, and a sophisticated arsenal of tools that allowed them to exploit every resource their environment had to offer. They had built a solid foundation, and upon this foundation, they were about to create something even more remarkable, a world of art, of symbol, and of spirit. They were ready to start painting their souls onto the walls of the deep earth. Chapter 4. The Great Hunt, Sustenance and Society on the Steppe. But before you can paint the soul of the beast, you first have to meet it. You have to understand it. You have to track it, and corner it, and face it, out there, in the wind and the ice. And that meeting was rarely a polite affair. The world of art and spirit that blossomed in the deep, quiet caves was fertilized by the blood and the fat and the sheer, terrifying reality of the hunt, because to these people, survival wasn't an abstract concept. It was a daily negotiation with a world of giants. Let's just take a moment and try to wrap our minds around what we're talking about here. When we say Ice Age animals, the mind conjures up some fairly standard images, maybe from a childhood museum trip, but the reality was so much grander, so much more substantial. We aren't talking about deer or bison as we know them. We're talking about megafauna. The prefix Nika is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, and it deserves our respect. Picture this. You step out of your shelter, a skin flap falling closed behind you. The air is so cold it feels like a physical slap, sharp and clean and utterly indifferent to you. The sky is a pale, vast sheet of blue-white, and in the distance, moving slowly across the immense grassy steppe, is a herd of woolly mammoths. But herd feels like too small a word. This is a slow-moving mountain range. Each individual animal is a walking fortress of shaggy brown-black hair, some 13 feet tall at the shoulder. That's high enough to look down into a second-story window in one of our modern houses. They weigh somewhere between 6 and 8 tons. Your family car weighs about 2. These are creatures of profound, earth-shaking gravity. As they move, you don't just see them, you feel them. A low, rhythmic tremor through the frozen soil. Their tusks, longer than a person is tall, curve majestically, first down, then out, then back in, like twin scythes of ivory, perfect for sweeping aside deep snow to get at the buried grasses beneath. You can see the steam of their breath pluming in the frigid air, each exhalation a small temporary cloud. And they are not alone. Further on you might see a woolly rhinoceros, not the sleek, grey creature we know today, but something more like a prehistoric tank, lower to the ground than the mammoth, but a dense, compact mass of muscle and fury, covered in a thick reddish-brown coat. Its head is held low, and from its snout juts a colossal horn, flattened like a blade, a battering ram of solid keratin designed for shoving and fighting and clearing paths through the Ice Age scrubland. They were notoriously bad-tempered, the Ice Age equivalent of a truck driver who has had a very, very bad day. Then there are the steppe bison, with horns that spanned a good 4 feet from tip to tip, or the giant Irish elk, whose antlers were a 12-foot-wide crown of bone, a walking thicket of points and tines. This was not a landscape of timid creatures. This was a world of titans, a place where the food chain was built on an industrial scale. And we, our ancestors, tiny, hairless and fragile by comparison, decided we were going to hunt them. It's a decision that borders on the absurd. It's like looking at a freight train and thinking, you know, I reckon I could wrestle that to a standstill for a sandwich. The sheer audacity is breathtaking. This wasn't just about courage, though it required an ocean of it. It was about a complete and total recalibration of what it meant to be a predator. A lion has claws and teeth. A wolf has speed and a crushing bite. We had our brains and our ability to work together. We had project management skills, and in the face of an 8-ton mammoth, project management was our sharpest claw, our most lethal tooth. Before a single spear was thrown, the hunt began as a quiet, intellectual exercise. It began with knowledge. These hunters were not just residents of the landscape. They were its librarians, its scholars. They had to know this world with an intimacy we can barely imagine. They knew the way the wind carried a scent on a snowy morning versus a clear, still afternoon. They could read a set of tracks in the frozen mud and tell you not just what animal made them, but how long ago, whether it was healthy or limping, ambling or panicked. They knew the migration routes of the great herds, the places they went for water, the valleys they favoured when the north wind blew its hardest. This knowledge was the product of generations. It was a database of environmental information, passed down not in books but in stories, in lessons, in quiet observations shared around the fire. It was a living, breathing encyclopedia of survival. They knew that the mammoths would follow the receding snow line in the spring, and that the bison would gather in certain river valleys in the autumn. They knew which narrow ravine a panicked herd would instinctively run into, and which boggy ground looked solid but would trap a heavy beast. Choosing the target was the first critical step. You don't just pick the biggest, angriest-looking bull. That's a rookie mistake. And in this line of work, you don't get to make many of those. An experienced hunting party would look for a sign of weakness, an individual that was older, perhaps struggling to keep up, one that was young and less experienced, or one that had become separated from the immense protective structure of the herd. The herd was the mammoth's greatest defense, a wall of fur, tusks, and parental fury. A single human was no match for a single mammoth. A band of humans was no match for a herd of mammoths. The entire game was about isolation. It was about using your intelligence to peel one animal away from its collective strength. This is where the planning kicked in. A hunt for megafauna wasn't a spontaneous event. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign. Scouts might track a herd for days, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect confluence of terrain, weather, and opportunity. They moved like ghosts on the edge of the herd's awareness, their senses tuned to the rhythm of the animals' lives. They were waiting for one to wander just a little too far into that box canyon, or to get caught on the wrong side of a river. While the scouts were away, the rest of the group would be preparing. This was a time of quiet, focused activity. The primary tool, the thing that allowed us to even enter this lethal conversation, was the spear. But don't picture a simple sharpened stick. This was a piece of sophisticated, life-saving technology. The shaft was made from a carefully selected piece of wood, ash, birch, yew, chosen for its combination of strength and flexibility. It would have been straightened painstakingly over a fire. The wood softened and coerced into a perfectly true line. The tip was the business end. A piece of high-quality flint or chert, knapped with incredible skill into a long leaf-shaped point. The process of flint knapping is a kind of percussive sculpture. You take a core of stone and using a hammerstone or a piece of antler, you strike it at just the right angle, with just the right amount of force to flake off a piece. A master knapper could see the finished tool inside the raw stone. They understood the subtle lines of force within the flint, how to create a razor-sharp edge and a strong symmetrical point. These points, like the one found embedded in the ribs of a mammoth at the Clovis site in New Mexico, were deadly. They were designed not just to pierce the thick hide, but to create a wide wound channel, to cause massive internal bleeding. The point was then hafted to the shaft, fitted into a groove and bound tightly with sinew, the tendons of other animals, and often sealed with a resin or bitumen glue. This was a composite tool, a marvel of engineering, and holding one must have felt like holding potential lightning. It was heavy, balanced, and utterly purposeful. But the spear, as effective as it was, had a significant limitation. Its range. To use it, you had to get close, dangerously, terrifyingly close, close enough to smell the mammoth's dusty, musky scent. close enough to see the intelligence and anger in its small dark eyes, close enough for its trunk to grab you, or its massive feet to turn you into a geological feature. Every hunt was a roll of the dice. And so, somewhere around 30,000 years ago, an invention appeared that would change the game completely. It was one of the first true force multipliers in human history. We call it the atar. The Aztecs called it that. But it was a technology used across the globe for millennia. In essence, it's a simple-looking stick, maybe 1.5 feet long, with a handle at one end and a small spur or hook at the other. Its brilliance lies in physics. The atlatl acts as an extension of the thrower's arm. It's a lever. When you throw a spear with an atlatl, you're not just using the muscles of your arm and shoulder, you're adding the length of the atlatl to your limb, dramatically increasing the arc and the speed of the throw. It's the same principle as a tennis racket hitting a ball versus just hitting it with your hand. The end of the atlatl moves much faster than your hand can. A spear launched from an atlatl could travel at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. It could fly further, with a flatter trajectory, and hit with vastly more kinetic energy than a hand-thrown spear. This was a revolution. The atlatl was the great equalizer. It allowed a hunter to project lethal force from a safer distance. You no longer had to be within arm's reach of the thundering hooves or the sweeping trunk. You could stand 50, maybe even 100 yards away, and deliver a powerful, penetrating strike. This innovation didn't just make hunting more effective, it made it more survivable. It lowered the risk just enough to tip the scales in our favor. The atlatls themselves were often more than just functional tools. They were works of art, carved from wood, bone, or ivory. They were frequently decorated with intricate engravings of animals. A famous example from France is carved in the shape of a mammoth. Perhaps this was a form of hunting magic, an attempt to capture the spirit of the animal, or maybe it was a mark of respect for the creature that sustained them. Or perhaps it was simply a way of honoring a tool that was so central to their existence. When your life depends on a piece of carved bone, you make it beautiful. You imbue it with meaning. So, the hunters are ready. Their spears are sharp. Their atlatls are ready. The scouts have returned with a report. A lone mammoth, an old bull, has been seen near the treacherous ground by the frozen creek. The plan is formulated. This is where the true human advantage comes to the fore. Cooperation. A mammoth hunt was a symphony of coordinated action. It required a level of teamwork that would be the envy of any modern corporation. There was no room for ego, no space for a glory-seeking maverick. Everyone had a role, and the success of the group depended on each individual executing their part flawlessly. The hunt might begin with a group of drivers. Their job wasn't to attack, but to gently, subtly pressure the mammoth, to move it in the desired direction without spooking it into a full-blown, unpredictable charge. They would use their knowledge of animal psychology, appearing on a ridge here, making a sound over there, using the landscape itself as a tool. Their goal was to guide the great beast towards the pre-selected trap. This could be a narrow gully where its movement would be restricted. It could be a steep cliff edge, or it could be a bog where the ground would give way under its immense weight, miring it in the thick, icy mud. Let's imagine they're using a natural trap, a place where a small stream has created a muddy, semi-frozen patch of ground. As the drivers guide the mammoth towards it, another team is waiting. The spearmen, the specialists. They are positioned downwind, silent and still as the stones around them. They are the tip of the spear, the final act in this long, carefully planned drama. The mammoth, feeling the pressure from behind, plows forward. It steps onto the seemingly solid ground, and the frozen crust breaks. Its massive legs sink deep into the muck. It lets out a bellow of confusion and rage, a sound that shakes the air. It struggles, but every movement only serves to mire it deeper. It is trapped. Now, the hunters close in, but it's not a chaotic rush. It's a disciplined, calculated approach. They use the atlatls first, launching a volley of spears from a distance. They aim for the vital areas they know so well from butchering countless other animals. The lungs, the heart, the soft underbelly. The spears thud into the thick, shaggy hide. The mammoth roars, thrashing its head, its trunk whipping through the air like a colossal snake. The danger is still immense. A wounded mammoth is arguably more dangerous than a healthy one. The hunters move in a coordinated dance, advancing and retreating, never giving the animal a single stationary target. The first volley is followed by another. The goal is not a single, lucky kill shot. The goal is to cause massive bleeding, to weaken the animal through a series of devastating wounds. It's a grim, brutal process of attrition. As the beast weakens, it struggles, becoming less powerful. A few of the bravest hunters might dart in close with heavy thrusting spears, delivering the final fatal blows. The silence that falls after the mammoth's last breath must have been profound. A silence filled with the panting of the hunters, the smell of blood on the cold air, and the overwhelming presence of the colossal still form. In that moment, there must have been a complex storm of emotions: exhaustion, relief, triumph, and perhaps a measure of respect, of sorrow, for the magnificent life they had just taken. They hadn't just killed an animal, they had felled a giant. They had, through their ingenuity and cooperation, proven themselves to be the most formidable predators on the planet. But the work was far from over. In fact, in many ways it had just begun. A dead mammoth is a treasure, a mountain of resources, but it's also a liability. The scent of blood would travel for miles, attracting every other predator in the region: cave hyenas, scimitar-toothed cats, giant short-faced bears, wolves. A kill site was a dangerous place to linger. The hunters had to work fast. This next phase was butchering, and it was just as organized and skill-intensive as the hunt itself. The toolkit changed. The long, elegant spear points were replaced by a variety of flint blades, scrapers, and choppers. First, the hide. A mammoth's hide was an inch thick, covered in dense wool and long guard hairs. Skinning it was a monumental task requiring immense strength and the sharpest of flint tools. The hide itself was an invaluable prize, destined to become clothing, shelter coverings, ropes, and containers. Once the hide was off, the methodical process of disassembly began. The hunters knew the anatomy of these animals intimately. They would work together to dismember the carcass, cutting away huge sections of muscle, each weighing hundreds of pounds. They would break open the great rib cage to access the organs, the heart, liver, and kidneys, which were rich in vitamins and minerals, and often eaten first, a reward for the successful hunters. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. The great limb bones were cracked open with heavy stones to get at the marrow, a hugely calorie-dense, nutritious food that was like a kind of Ice Age super butter. The skull would be broken into to retrieve the brain, another fatty delicacy. The sinews were carefully stripped from the muscles to be dried and used as cordage for sewing and hafting tools. Even the stomach contents, the partially digested grasses and herbs, could be a source of valuable plant nutrients. A single mammoth could provide thousands of pounds of meat, hundreds of pounds of fat, and a treasure trove of raw materials like hide, bone, and ivory. It was enough to sustain a group of 25 people for weeks, even months. Transporting this bounty back to the main camp was another logistical challenge. They couldn't move the whole animal, so the kill site became a temporary processing plant. Meat was cut into manageable strips and chunks. Bones were selected for their marrow, or for their potential as tools or fuel. The group would work tirelessly, a coordinated production line of human and stone tool, until the carcass was reduced to its constituent, useful parts. Then, laden with heavy packs of meat and hide, they would begin the long, arduous journey back home, leaving behind only a skeleton for the scavengers. The return of a successful hunting party was a moment of profound importance for the entire community. It meant more than just food. It meant security. It meant the difference between thriving and starving through the lean months ahead. It would be met with celebration. The fresh meat would be cooked over the fire, the smell of roasting fat filling the air. This was the payoff for all the risk, the planning, and the hard work. And this is where the hunt truly reveals its role in shaping society. The distribution of the meat was a critical social event. It's highly unlikely that it was a free-for-all. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups suggest that there were complex, deeply ingrained rules about sharing. Certain parts of the animal might be allocated to the hunters who made the kill. Other portions would go to the toolmakers who fashioned the spear points. Portions would be given to the families of everyone in the group, ensuring that the elderly, the young, and those who did not participate directly in the hunt were all provided for. This sharing wasn't just about charity. It was a form of social insurance. The best hunter in the group might be successful today, but next week he could be injured or sick or simply unlucky. By sharing the bounty of a successful hunt, the group ensured its collective survival. It reinforced bonds of kinship and mutual obligation. It was the glue that held their society together. The mammoth wasn't just feeding their bodies, it was feeding their community, strengthening the very fabric of their social world. But it's easy to get lost in the high drama of the great mammoth hunt. It's the blockbuster movie of the Paleolithic, and while these high-risk, high-reward hunts were undoubtedly crucial, they were not the whole story. To focus only on them is to get a skewed picture of the Ice Age diet. A successful mammoth hunt might happen only a few times a year. It was the bonanza, the jackpot. But you can't live your life waiting to win the lottery. The day-to-day reality of subsistence was likely much quieter, much less glamorous, but just as important. The foundation of their diet, the reliable calories that filled the gaps between the great hunts, came from other, more humble sources, and this work was done by everyone. Let's talk about foraging. The mammoth steppe was not just a great pasture for megafauna, it was also a complex ecosystem filled with a variety of plants, if you knew where to look and what to look for. This was another domain of deep, encyclopedic knowledge, likely held and passed down primarily by the women of the group. They would have known which roots and tubers were edible, and which were poisonous. They would have had mental maps of the landscape, knowing where the wild onions grew, where to find the starchy cattail roots near the marshes, and when the few hardy berries would ripen in the brief, intense summer. This was skilled labor. It required specialized tools, digging sticks to pry up stubborn roots, woven baskets or skin bags to carry the harvest. It was a constant, steady contribution to the group's larder. The carbohydrates and vitamins from these plants provided a crucial balance to the protein and fat-heavy diet of meat. It wasn't as exciting as facing down a woolly rhino, but it was just as vital for long-term health and survival. Then there was the pursuit of smaller game. The landscape was teeming with it. Hares, Arctic foxes, ground squirrels, birds like ptarmigan and grouse. These animals couldn't feed a whole band for a month, but they could provide a meal for a day. Hunting them required a different skill set, a different toolkit. Instead of heavy spears, it involved snares and traps, cleverly made from sinew and sticks, placed along game trails. It might involve throwing sticks to knock birds out of the air, or using nets woven from plant fibers or hair. This kind of hunting was often a lower-risk activity, something that older children or less experienced hunters could participate in, learning the skills of tracking and animal behavior on a smaller, more manageable scale. It was a constant opportunistic source of fresh protein, the reliable background hum of subsistence that kept the camp fed. And we shouldn't forget the water. Rivers, lakes, and coastal areas were rich with resources. Fish like salmon, trout, and pike would have been a major food source where available. Archaeological sites have yielded beautifully crafted bone and antler harpoons with multiple barbs, designed to spear large fish in shallow water. There is evidence of woven nets and of weirs, stone or wooden fences built across streams to funnel fish into traps. Shellfish were gathered along coastlines, providing a rich, easily accessible source of food. Seals and seabirds were also hunted. Their fat and meat a welcome addition to the diet. So you have to picture the Paleolithic economy, not as a single-minded pursuit of mammoth, but as a diversified portfolio of resources. The great hunts were the high-yield, high-risk stocks. The foraging, trapping, and fishing were the stable, reliable bonds. A smart community, a successful community, invested in all of them. This diversification also speaks to a more complex and egalitarian social structure than the old man-the-hunter stereotype would suggest. It wasn't a world where the men went out for heroic hunts while the women and children waited passively back at camp. It was a world where everyone had a vital economic role. The knowledge of the women who could identify hundreds of edible and medicinal plants was just as critical as the courage of the men who faced the mammoth. The children who learned to set snares for hares were contributing directly to the family's welfare. Survival was a team sport, and everyone was on the field. The final piece of this intricate puzzle of sustenance was perhaps the most forward-thinking of all: food preservation. One of the biggest problems with a successful mammoth hunt is the sudden, overwhelming surplus. You have, for a brief period, far more meat than the group can possibly eat before it spoils. In a world without refrigeration, this was a serious challenge. Wasting that much hard-won food was not an option. So they developed ingenious methods to make it last. The cold of the Ice Age itself was their greatest ally. They could dig pits into the permafrost, the permanently frozen layer of soil, creating natural freezers where they could store large chunks of meat for months. This was their deep freeze, but the most common method was likely drying. Meat would be cut into thin strips and hung on racks in the open air. The cold, dry winds of the steppe would wick the moisture away, a process we call sublimation, where the ice in the frozen meat turns directly into water vapor. This created a kind of prehistoric jerky lightweight, nutrient-dense and stable for long periods. It was the perfect travel food, a reliable source of protein that could be carried on long journeys or stored for the leanest parts of winter. They also used the smoke from their fires. A smoky hearth wasn't just for warmth and cooking, it was a food preservation device. Hanging strips of meat or fish in the smoky upper reaches of a shelter would both dry them and infuse them with chemical compounds from the smoke that inhibit bacterial growth. The result was a preserved, flavorful food that could last for a very long time. Fat was another critical resource to be preserved. They would render it down, melting the huge chunks of mammoth fat over a fire. The pure liquid fat or tallow could be stored in skin bags or even in the animal's own stomach. This rendered fat was a high-energy food source, a critical fuel for their bodies during the brutal cold. It was also used as a literal fuel for lamps. A piece of moss in a hollowed-out stone filled with tallow made a simple, effective lamp to light the darkness of the long winter nights. It was used to waterproof clothing and to mix with ochre to make paint. Fat was the concentrated energy of the Ice Age, and not a drop was wasted. So the rhythm of their life was a cycle of intense, dangerous acquisition, followed by long periods of careful, meticulous processing and preservation. The hunt was the explosion of energy. The days and weeks that followed were the quiet, focused work of turning that energy into long-term security. The camp would have been a hive of activity, people cutting meat, scraping hides, pounding pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, and mending tools. It was this combination of daring predation, broad-spectrum foraging, and intelligent foresight that allowed them to thrive in an environment that seems, to us, almost impossibly harsh. The Great Hunt was the centerpiece, the engine that drove so much of their culture. It demanded the highest levels of technological skill, of physical courage, and of social cohesion. It was a crucible in which their bonds were forged, the shared experience of risk and reward that defined their community. When we look at the cave paintings they would later create, those magnificent images of bison, horses, and mammoths, we are not looking at a simple menu of what they ate. We are looking at the heart of their world. We are seeing the powerful, respected, and feared beings with whom they shared their landscape. The hunt was a relationship, a deep and complex dialogue between hunter and hunted. It was a dance of life and death on the frozen steppe, a dance that required a deep understanding of the other's steps. And in performing that dance, in rising to that immense challenge, our ancestors didn't just find food for their bodies, they found the structure for their society, and the inspiration for their souls. They earned their place in the world, one terrifying, glorious hunt at a time. Their stories whispered around a fire fueled by the bones of the very giants they had conquered. Chapter 5. The Awakening Mind. Art, Symbol, and Ritual. And what stories they were. Stories so powerful, so fundamental, that whispering them wasn't always enough. A story spoken to the wind is gone in a moment. A lesson shared is only as durable as the memory of the listener. But what if you could make a story last? What if you could give an idea a solid form? Something you could see, touch, or hold? What if you could tell a story to the ages? The human mind, sharpened by the immense challenges of survival, was beginning to ask itself these questions. It was no longer enough just to live in the world. A new irresistible urge was bubbling up from the deepest parts of our consciousness, the urge to understand the world, to capture it, and to find our own meaning within its vast and terrifying beauty. This is the story of the Great Awakening. It's the moment our ancestors lifted their heads from the daily grind of the hunt, from the chipping of stone and the dressing of hides, and began to create things that had no immediate practical purpose, things that didn't fill a belly or keep out the cold, things that were, for lack of a better word, beautiful, or powerful, or sacred. They began to decorate the world, and in doing so they decorated their own minds. building the first cathedrals of human thought, not out of stone and glass, but out of ochre and ivory and sound and silence. To find the first of these great cathedrals, we have to go on a journey, and it's not an easy one. Forget a comfortable Sunday drive to a museum. First, you must find the right cave. Not just any hole in the ground, but a specific kind of limestone cave, carved by water over millennia, creating a network of passages leading deep into the belly of the earth. You leave the world behind. The light of the sun, the scent of the pines, the sound of the wind, it all fades. You are entering another reality. You light your lamp, a simple thing, a hollowed-out piece of stone filled with animal fat, tallow from a reindeer or a bison, with a wick of moss or juniper. It doesn't give off a steady, sterile glow like a modern light bulb. It sputters, it flickers, it casts deep, dancing shadows. The light is alive, and it makes everything around you feel alive too. The air grows cold, a constant deep-seated chill that has nothing to do with the winter outside. This is the cold of the rock itself, a cold that has been here for 1,000,000 years. The only sounds are the drip, drip, drip of water percolating through the stone, echoing in the vast silence, and the soft shuffle of your own feet on the cave floor. You might have to crawl, squeezing through passages so tight they're called cat holes, your shoulders scraping against the damp, gritty walls. You might have to climb, using natural handholds or perhaps a crude wooden ladder left by others before you, descending into chambers so vast your little lamp can't even illuminate the far walls. This is not a space humans were meant to occupy. It is a profoundly alien environment, and it is here, in the deepest, most inaccessible, most dangerous parts of the underworld, that they decided to build their galleries. Imagine you are in what we now call Chauvet Cave, in modern-day France. You've journeyed deep inside, and you round a corner. Your flickering lamp catches something on the wall. At first, it's just a line of red ochre, but as you get closer, the lines resolve into a shape, and then another, and another. Suddenly, you are no longer alone in the dark. You are surrounded by a world teeming with life. A pride of lions, 36 of them, stalks across the rock. They are rendered with a confidence and an understanding of anatomy that is simply breathtaking. They aren't flat, static cartoons. They have weight, their muscles tense. Some are sniffing the ground. Others have their heads raised, alert. They seem to be hunting, a silent, frozen explosion of predatory focus. Your flickering lamp makes the shadows on their bodies shift and move. For a terrifying, magical second, you could swear they were breathing. You move your light and find more. A herd of woolly rhinoceroses, their heads lowered, charging at one another, their horns clashing in a silent, eternal battle. A panel of horses, their heads tossing, their nostrils flared, so full of vitality you can almost hear them snorting in the cold air. Megaloceros, the giant deer, their enormous antlers rendered in perfect, delicate detail. And bears, huge cave bears, their outlines scratched into the soft surface of the rock, their spirits seeming to haunt the very place where their real-life counterparts once hibernated. This is art that is over 32,000 years old. 32,000. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramids of Giza are about 4,500 years old. The Roman Colosseum is 2,000 years old. Chauvet was ancient when the first stones were being laid for Stonehenge. And yet the skill, the artistry, the sheer dynamism of what is on these walls feels utterly modern. It's not primitive, it's primal. It speaks a visual language that bypasses millennia and connects directly with us. And Chauvet is just one. Travel forward in time about 15,000 years and enter another cave, Lascaux, the so-called Sistine Chapel of prehistory. Here the art is different. It's an explosion of colour and scale. You enter a vast chamber known as the Hall of the Bulls, and you are simply overwhelmed. The figures are enormous. 4 huge aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, dominate the space, some of them more than 17 feet long. To paint them, the artists had to build scaffolding. We found the holes in the walls where the wooden beams were inserted. Imagine it, in the near-total darkness, perched precariously on a rickety structure, holding a flickering, smoking lamp in one hand, a brush made of animal hair or a blowpipe of hollowed-out bone in the other, painting these monumental figures onto the curving, uneven canvas of the cave ceiling. The colours are rich, vibrant reds and yellows from ground-up iron oxides, ochre, and deep blacks from charcoal or manganese dioxide. They would grind these minerals into a fine powder, then mix it with a binder, perhaps cave water rich in calcium carbonate, or animal fat, or even blood or urine, to make it stick to the wall. They applied it with brushes, with pads of moss or fur, and they sprayed it, using their own mouths or a hollow bone as a kind of prehistoric airbrush to create soft edges and shading. This wasn't a doodle, this was a production. It was a planned, deliberate, and incredibly difficult undertaking. And everywhere there are animals: horses, bison, stags with magnificent antlers, and a strange, enigmatic creature that some have called the unicorn. But one thing is conspicuously rare: humans. When humans are depicted, they are often stick figures, simplistic and almost comically undetailed compared to the loving, realistic portrayal of the animals. In Lascaux, there is a famous, mysterious scene deep in a part of the cave called the Shaft. A great bison, disemboweled, its entrails spilling out, stands over a prone stick figure of a man. The man has the head of a bird. Next to him lies a staff, also topped with a bird. What on earth is going on here? Is it a hunting accident? A myth? A vision? We are looking at a story, but we've forgotten how to read the language. And then there are the hands. In many caves you find them. Sometimes they are positive prints, a hand dipped in pigment and pressed to the wall, but more often they are stencils, a hand placed flat against the rock and pigment blown around it, leaving a ghostly negative outline. I was here. It is the most direct, personal, and haunting message from the deep past. Sometimes the hands are missing fingers. Were these injuries from frostbite or accidents, or were they a form of ritual mutilation, a sacrifice? We just don't know, but seeing them, you feel a direct connection. You could place your own hand against that outline, and for a moment bridge the chasm of 30,000 years. So the great, obvious question hangs in the silent, cold air of the caves. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why crawl into the most dangerous, inaccessible parts of the world to paint pictures of animals that you would then almost never look at? This wasn't a living room gallery. These places were visited rarely, perhaps only for special occasions. Archaeologists, which is a polite way of saying people who love a good argument, have been debating this for a century. The first and most straightforward idea was called hunting magic. The theory goes that by painting an animal, you gain some kind of mystical power over it. If you paint a bison with a spear in its side, you are ensuring the success of the hunt. It's a form of sympathetic magic, a ritual to stack the odds in your favor in a world where a failed hunt meant starvation. It's a lovely, simple theory, and it's almost certainly not the whole story. For one thing, the animals painted on the walls don't always match the bones of the animals found in the cave entrances, the ones they were actually eating. In many places they ate a lot of reindeer, but painted very few. They painted lions and bears, animals they likely feared and avoided, not hunted for food. And why do it in the deepest, darkest part of the cave? If it's about the hunt tomorrow, why not do it out in the open, where all the hunters can see it and take part? This led to another, more profound theory, championed by the archaeologist David Lewis Williams. He suggested that the caves were not just art galleries, they were portals. They were membranes between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. The people who made these paintings were not just artists, they were shamans. They would enter the cave as a way of entering a trance, a state of altered consciousness, perhaps aided by sensory deprivation in the deep, dark, rhythmic chanting, or even hallucinogenic plants. In this trance state, the shaman would journey to the spirit world, and the rock wall of the cave itself would become a kind of veil. The spirits of the animals, the powerful horse spirit, the bison spirit, the lion spirit, would press against that veil, and the shaman's job was to reach through, to touch them, to draw them out, and to fix their image onto the rock. The paintings in this view are not just pictures of animals, they are the spirit animals themselves, brought forth from the other side. This would explain why the paintings often use the natural bumps and curves of the cave wall to give the animals a three-dimensional quality, as if they are emerging from the rock itself. It would also explain the strange geometric shapes, dots, grids, squiggly lines that often accompany the paintings. These, Lewis Williams argued, are entoptic phenomena, the kinds of patterns your brain generates internally when you enter a trance state. You see them with your eyes closed, The paintings, then, are a record of a sacred, terrifying, and deeply personal vision quest. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe the caves were classrooms. Maybe they were the first libraries, the first history books. Imagine an elder of the clan taking a group of young initiates deep into the earth. In the flickering firelight, they would tell the stories. This is the great aurochs who gave us life. This is the story of how our ancestor, the Birdman, was slain but brought back to life. These are the animals of our world. You must know them. You must respect them. This is who we are. The images would burn themselves into the minds of the young, a way of transmitting crucial cultural knowledge, mythologies and social rules from one generation to the next, long before the invention of writing. The caves were the sacred texts of the Ice Age. The truth is, it was probably a mix of all these things, and more that we can't even imagine. It was a religion, a ritual, a social event, a history lesson, and a work of art, all rolled into one. What we can say for sure is that it reveals a mind that was capable of profound symbolic and abstract thought, a mind that was wrestling with the big questions. And this explosion of creativity wasn't confined to the great dark cathedrals of the earth. People began to carry art with them, to weave it into the fabric of their daily lives. Let's leave the deep caves and step back out into the cold sunlight of the Ice Age world. The art here is smaller, more intimate. It's the art of the hearth, of the campsite. It's art you can hold in your hand. Our ancestors began carving. They took the bones of the animals they ate, the antlers shed by reindeer, the ivory tusks of the mighty mammoth, and with tiny sharp flint burins they began to shape them. The patience this required is almost impossible for us to comprehend. Ivory, in particular, is an incredibly hard material to work. It would take hundreds of hours of patient scraping, incising and polishing to create a single small object. And what did they make? They made the world around them. They carved stunningly realistic images of animals onto their tools. A spear thrower, a tool used to add leverage and power to a spear cast, would be carved into the shape of a leaping horse or a mammoth. Why? It doesn't make the spear fly any farther, but it makes the tool special. It imbues it with the spirit of the animal, a nod to the hunting magic theory perhaps, or maybe it's just a mark of pride, of identity. I am the man who hunts with the mammoth spear thrower. This tool is mine. One of the most beautiful examples is a piece known as the swimming reindeer, found in France. It's carved from the tip of a mammoth tusk, and it shows two reindeer, one male and one female, swimming nose to tail. The detail is exquisite. You can see the texture of their fur, the strain in their necks as they paddle through an invisible river. The artist had clearly spent countless hours simply watching reindeer, observing them with a naturalist's eye, and then translated that deep knowledge into a work of profound and gentle beauty. This wasn't just a toolmaker. This was a Michelangelo of the tundra. They also carved purely decorative objects, pieces of bone or ivory covered in intricate geometric patterns, lines, and notches. Some have argued that these might be the world's first calendars, lunar tallies used to track the seasons, the phases of the moon, or perhaps the migratory patterns of animals. Or maybe, and this is a thought both humbling and comforting, they were just decorations. Maybe in the long, dark, boring hours of an Arctic winter, with the wind howling outside the skin tent, a person sat by the fire and patiently carved lines onto a piece of bone, simply because it was satisfying to do so. The human mind abhors a vacuum, both in sound and on a blank surface. We have a deep need to make our mark, to create order out of chaos. And then there are the most famous and most enigmatic of all these portable objects, the so-called Venus figurines. They have been found all across Europe, from the Pyrenees to Siberia, a cultural phenomenon that lasted for thousands of years, and they are striking. They are small statuettes, usually carved from ivory, stone or bone, and sometimes fired from clay, making them some of the earliest ceramic objects in the world. And they almost all share a set of very specific characteristics. They are unmistakably female, but they are not what you would call realistic portraits. The breasts are large and heavy, the belly is rounded, the hips and buttocks voluminous, the thighs are substantial. These are bodies that speak of fat stores, of fertility, of survival, but the other parts of the body are almost completely ignored. The arms and feet are often tiny nubs, or missing altogether, and most strangely, they have no faces. The head is often just a simple sphere, sometimes covered with a textured pattern that might represent braided hair or a woven cap. But there are no eyes, no nose, no mouth. The most famous of these is the Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria. She's only about 4 inches tall, carved from a type of limestone not native to the area where she was found, and she was originally covered in red ochre. She fits perfectly in the palm of your hand. Holding a replica today, you can't help but be struck by her tactile quality. She feels ancient, solid, and powerful. So what is she? What are these faceless, voluptuous little figures that so obsessed our ancestors? The most obvious theory is that they are fertility goddesses. In a world where life was fragile, where childbirth was perilous, and where the continuation of the clan was paramount, these could be powerful charms, idols to be prayed to for the survival of your children and the abundance of your people. They are symbols of life in the face of the overwhelming power of the Ice Age winter, Mother Earth in portable form. But there are other ideas. Some have suggested they were obstetric aids, tools used to teach young women about pregnancy and childbirth. They are a kind of textbook, showing the changes a woman's body goes to. This is a fascinating theory because it places the figurines firmly in the world of women, created by women for women. A more recent and intimate theory, proposed by anthropologist Catherine Hodge McCoy, is that they may be the first examples of female self-portraits. If a woman without a mirror were to look down at her own body, what would she see? She would see her chest, her stomach, her thighs, all foreshortened by perspective. Her own face would be invisible, and her feet would be hidden by her belly and breasts. The figurines in this light are not an exaggerated, stylized representation of a woman, but a perfectly realistic representation of your own body, from your own point of view. It's a stunning shift in perspective, transforming these objects from distant idols into something deeply personal and introspective. Of course, there's the more prosaic, and perhaps cynical view that they are simply Stone Age pornography. This is almost certainly a modern projection, viewing the past through the lens of our own culture's obsessions. For one thing, their faceless anonymity makes them universal, not personal, and their context as precious, labor-intensive objects suggests they were something far more significant than a mere private thrill. Ultimately, like the cave paintings, they are probably a little of everything. They were likely a common symbolic language shared by different groups of people across a vast continent. Finding a Venus figurine at a new campsite might be a sign that you were among friends, people who shared your beliefs and your understanding of the world. They were a social glue, a symbol of a shared culture. This idea of a shared culture of identity becomes even more personal when we look at what our ancestors chose to wear, because at the same time as all this other art was being created, we see the first explosion of personal adornment, jewelry. This is a profound step. Decorating your tools or your cave is one thing. Decorating your own body is a statement. It's a statement about who you are, what group you belong to, what your status is. They made beads, tens of thousands of them. They would take a small piece of mammoth ivory and, with incredible skill, drill a tiny hole through it. They would take shells, sometimes from hundreds of miles away, showing the existence of long-distance trade networks, and perforate them to be strung on a cord. They would use the teeth of foxes, wolves, and deer as pendants. Think about the effort, the time it would take, with a simple flint drill to bore a hole through a fox canine without shattering it. The hours spent grinding and polishing a single ivory bead, and they didn't just make one or two, they made them by the hundreds, by the thousands. Nowhere is this more evident than at a site called Sungir, near Moscow in Russia. Here, archaeologists found the graves of 3 individuals who lived around 34,000 years ago. One was an older man. He was buried laid out on his back, and his clothing, which had long since rotted away, had been decorated with nearly 3,000 painstakingly carved and polished mammoth ivory beads. He wore a beaded cap on his head, and bracelets of mammoth ivory on his arms. Even more astonishing were the graves of 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a girl of about 9, who were buried head to head. Between them, their clothing was covered in over 10,000 ivory beads. They also had bracelets, rings, and were accompanied by exquisitely crafted ivory spears, lances, and carved animal figures. The amount of labor represented in this burial is staggering. One estimate suggests that each bead took at least an hour to make, That's 10,000 hours of work just for the beads in the children's grave. That is one person working 40 hours a week for 5 years straight. This tells us something incredibly important. These were not simple, egalitarian hunter-gatherers, as is often assumed. This society was complex enough to be able to afford to dedicate that much time and energy to a non-utilitarian task. It suggests that these individuals, this man, these children, held an incredibly high status. Were they leaders, shamans, the children of a powerful chief? We don't know. But what we do know is that their community loved them. They grieved for them, and they honored them with the most precious thing they had, their time, their skill, their artistry. This is the birth of social identity, made visible. It's the ancestor of the crown, the business suit, the punk rock jacket. It is us, telling the world who we are. So we have decorated our sacred spaces. We have decorated our tools. We have decorated our bodies. Our world is becoming rich with visual symbolism. But what about the other senses? What did the Ice Age sound like? Beyond the wind, the cry of birds, and the crackle of the fire, was there anything else? Was there music? The answer, incredibly, is yes. In caves in Germany, particularly at a site called Hohlefels, archaeologists have found flutes. They are the oldest confirmed musical instruments in the world, dating back some 40,000 years. One is made from the hollow wing bone of a griffon vulture. It has 5 finger holes and a V-shaped notch at one end to blow into. Another is even more remarkable, painstakingly carved from 2 separate hollowed-out pieces of mammoth ivory, which were then fitted together and sealed with resin to be perfectly airtight. This is not a simple whistle. This is a sophisticated and deliberately crafted instrument, capable of playing complex melodies. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. Imagine sitting in a cave or in a mammoth bone hut on the frozen steppe. The world outside is vast, silent, and indifferent, but inside, someone picks up a small flute carved from the bone of a bird and begins to play. A high, clear, haunting melody fills the air. It's a sound that is purely human. It's not the sound of survival, it's the sound of a soul expressing itself. What was this music for? Was it part of a shamanic ritual? The notes meant to carry a prayer to the spirit world, or to induce a trance? Did it accompany the telling of the great stories, a soundtrack to the myths? Or was it for dancing, for celebration, for community bonding after a successful hunt? Or maybe, just maybe, it was for the simple joy of it. Maybe a parent played a lullaby to a child on a flute made of ivory. Maybe friends sat around a fire and played tunes together to pass the long winter nights. The existence of music tells us that their emotional lives were as rich and as complex as our own. They knew sorrow, and they knew joy, and they found a way to give those feelings a voice that wasn't made of words. All of this, the paintings on the walls, the carvings in our hands, the beads on our chests, the music in the air, all of it points to the single most important development in human history, the full awakening of the symbolic mind. This is the moment we began to live in 2 worlds at once. There was the real world, the world of rock and ice and mammoth and flint. And then there was the world of ideas, the world of symbols. A painting of a bison is not a bison. You cannot eat it. You cannot make a cloak from its hide. But it represents the idea of a bison. It carries the meaning of bisonness. A bead is not just a piece of ivory. It is a symbol of status, of identity. A series of notes on a flute is not just a sound. It is a feeling, a story, a mood. This leap into abstraction is everything. It is the foundation of language, of religion, of mathematics, of art, of everything we call culture. Our Ice Age ancestors were not the grunting, brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were us. Their brains were identical to ours, and they were using those brains to do what humans have always done, to make sense of their place in the universe. They were looking up at the stars and seeing patterns. They were looking at the cycle of the seasons and seeing a story of death and rebirth. They were looking at the animals they shared the world with and seeing not just food, but powerful spirits, partners in the great dance of existence. They were building a cosmology. The art they left behind is a faint, beautiful echo of that lost world of thought. It's a message in a bottle, washed up on the shores of our time. We can't read it perfectly. The context is gone forever, but we can feel its power. We can sense the intelligence, the creativity, and the deep, soulful humanity that produced it. They were not just surviving the cold of the frozen world. They had found a way to kindle an inner fire, a fire of meaning, of beauty, and of wonder. And the warmth of that fire, ignited in the deepest parts of the Ice Age, has been passed down from generation to generation, and it continues to burn within us to this day. It is perhaps their greatest and most enduring gift. Chapter 6. The Great Thaw. Surviving the end of a world, but that fire, that beautiful, resilient human fire, was about to be tested in a way that no one, not in their wildest dreams or most terrifying nightmares, could ever have foreseen. For the world they knew, the vast, frozen, predictable world of ice and steppe, was beginning to die, not with a bang, not with a sudden cataclysm, but with a whisper, a soft, insidious and utterly relentless dripping sound. It's a strange thing, the end of a world. We imagine it as a sudden event, a flash of light, a final dramatic curtain call. But the end of the Pleistocene, the Great Ice Age, was a slow, drawn-out affair. It was a change that you might not even notice from one day to the next. Perhaps it started with a winter that was just a little less brutal than the last, a spring that arrived a week or two earlier than your grandfather remembered. The air, for the first time in 10,000 years, started to carry a new scent on the wind, not just the sharp, sterile perfume of ice and frozen earth, but the smell of damp soil, of meltwater, of life stirring where it had no business being. For a generation, it might have seemed like a blessing, a reprieve from the eternal, grinding cold that had defined their entire existence. The great enemy, the cold that crept into your bones and stole the breath from your lungs, was finally beginning to retreat. You can imagine the conversations around the fire, the elders shaking their heads, speaking of strange weather, of animal migrations shifting in ways they couldn't explain. The hunters, returning from their long treks, might have spoken of new rivers of meltwater carving their way through the permafrost, of the great glaciers to the north making unsettling groaning sounds, like a sleeping giant stirring in its bed. But this wasn't a gentle awakening. It was the death rattle of a frozen world. The planet was warming up, and it was doing so with a speed that was, in geological terms, absolutely terrifying. The great ice sheets that had held a third of the world's water in their frozen grip for millennia were starting to come apart at the seams, and as they did, they released that water back into the world. First, it came in floods, not the kind of floods we know, where a river spills its banks for a few days. These were events on a scale that defies modern comprehension. Imagine vast lakes, larger than any of the Great Lakes today, held back by dams made of sheer ice. These were the proglacial lakes, and they were ticking time bombs. As the climate warmed, these ice dams would weaken, groan, and then fail catastrophically. The resulting flood, the outburst flood, would have been one of the most powerful and destructive forces on the planet. A wall of water, hundreds of feet high, carrying icebergs the size of hills and boulders the size of houses, would have scoured the landscape clean, erasing everything in its path. An entire generation of people, their hunting grounds, their sacred sites, all washed away in a matter of hours. For those who witnessed it from a safe distance, it would have been a vision of the apocalypse. The world itself seemed to be coming undone, the very ground beneath their feet liquefied and remade before their eyes. We can still see the scars of these events today, in places like the channeled scablands of Washington state, where the land looks like it was clawed at by a furious god. For the people who lived there, it wasn't geology, it was the end. And even for those who didn't live in the direct path of these mega-floods, the water was coming for them all the same. It came more slowly, more subtly, but just as relentlessly. Every melting glacier, every shrinking ice sheet, was pouring its lifeblood into the oceans. And the oceans began to rise. Think about the world map as they knew it. It was a map drawn by the ice. With so much water locked up in the glaciers, sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than they are today. Coastlines were miles and miles further out. Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula of northern Europe, a rolling highland connected by a vast fertile plain. Australia, Tasmania and New Guinea were a single giant continent called Sahul. Siberia and Alaska were joined by the broad land bridge of Beringia. These weren't just lines on a map. These were homelands. They were the richest, most productive parts of their world. The coastal plains, the river deltas, the estuaries teemed with life. They were the Ice Age equivalent of a supermarket, offering a reliable bounty of fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. For countless generations, this was simply the way the world was. The coast was the coast. The hunting grounds were the hunting grounds. And then, year by year, the sea began to rise. It wasn't a tidal wave. It was a slow, inexorable creep, a process so gradual that a single person might not notice it in a year, or even 5, but over a lifetime, it would be undeniable. The shoreline where your grandfather taught you to fish was now 30 feet underwater. The sacred grove of trees where your people had gathered for generations was now a salt marsh. The very concept of permanent began to dissolve. Let's journey for a moment to one of these lost worlds, perhaps the most famous of them, Doggerland. This was the vast, low-lying plain that connected Britain to mainland Europe. It wasn't a barren wasteland. It was a vibrant landscape of rolling hills, meandering rivers, marshes, and forests. It was a paradise for hunter-gatherers. Herds of aurochs and red deer roamed its woodlands. Its rivers were fat with salmon. Its coasts were a treasure trove of food. For the people who lived there, this was the center of the world. Now, imagine being one of them. You are born in a camp by a wide, slow-moving river. As a child, you learn the paths through the woods, the best places to find flint, the migratory routes of the animals. You know this land as intimately as you know your own hand, but you also hear the stories from the elders, stories of how the great salt water, the ocean, is angry, how it eats the land. As you grow, you see it for yourself. The winter storms seem to get worse each year, pushing the sea further and further inland. The high tide mark creeps a little higher. A patch of land that was once good for grazing is now too marshy, too salty. Your family has to move your seasonal camp, not by a few feet, but by a few hundred yards, further inland than ever before. Your neighbors, the people who lived in the next valley over, have had to move as well. The world feels like it's shrinking. The anxiety must have been a constant, low hum in the background of their lives, a kind of existential dread that we can barely imagine. We worry about property values and flood insurance. They watched their entire world, their physical and spiritual landscape, being slowly, methodically drowned. Every generation was pushed back, a forced retreat from an enemy you couldn't fight, an enemy made of water and time. This process went on for thousands of years, a slow-motion catastrophe. Eventually, the heartland of Doggerland, the great river valleys, became a vast estuary, then a bay, and then a series of islands. The final connections were severed. The high ground of Britain became a true island. The people were separated forever from their continental cousins. Their entire history, their ancestral lands, their sacred places, now lay silent beneath the cold, grey waters of the North Sea. And they were not the only ones. All over the world, from the coasts of Southeast Asia to the shores of the Americas, entire countries, entire human worlds, were being swallowed by the rising tide. This was the great forgetting, a loss of land and memory on a planetary scale. As if losing your entire country to the sea wasn't enough, the world on dry land was changing just as dramatically. The food source that had defined the Ice Age, the very foundation of their culture, was beginning to disappear. The megafauna were dying. The great herds of woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinos, the giant deer, the cave bears. These creatures were not just a walking larder. They were the central figures in a cosmic drama. Their images covered the walls of the great painted caves. Their migrations dictated the rhythm of human life. Their bones and tusks provided the raw materials for tools, for homes, and for art. Hunting a mammoth was not just about getting meat. It was a deeply spiritual, communal act that bound a group together and affirmed their place in the world. A successful hunt was a guarantee of life for months to come. It was security, wealth, and meaning, all rolled into one. And now, they were vanishing. The reasons are complex, and still debated by scientists today. The rapid climate change was certainly a major factor. The environment to which they were so perfectly adapted was disappearing before their eyes. The vast open steppe, the mammoth steppe, was a unique environment, a cold, dry grassland rich in the specific types of grasses and forbs these giant herbivores needed to survive. As the world warmed and became wetter, this ecosystem began to fail. The grasslands were replaced by dense, impassable forests in some areas, and soggy, unproductive bog and tundra in others. The mammoths' food supply was literally being pulled out from under their feet. Their ranges shrank. Their populations became fragmented and isolated. They were creatures built for a world of ice, and the ice was gone. Human hunting pressure undoubtedly played a role as well. These were skilled, experienced hunters with a deep knowledge of their prey. As the mammoth populations became stressed and weakened by the changing environment, they would have become easier targets. It was likely a deadly combination, a world that was becoming toxic to them, and a predator that was becoming ever more efficient. For the people, this wasn't an abstract ecological event. It was a profound and terrifying crisis. Imagine being a hunter, your entire identity and skill set built around the pursuit of these magnificent beasts. You follow the old migration routes, the ones your father and his father followed, but the herds are smaller this year. The animals look thinner, less healthy. The next year they don't show up at all. You push further and further into new territory, searching for them. You find their tracks, but they are few and far between. You find their bones bleaching in the sun on the newly green plains. It must have felt like the world was emptying out. The great thundering presence that had been a constant for tens of thousands of years was fading to a whisper, and then to silence. The last mammoths held on in isolated pockets, like Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia for thousands of years. But for most of humanity, they were gone. The central pillar of their existence had crumbled. They were left in a new world, a world without giants, and they had to figure out how to survive. The new world that was emerging from the corpse of the old was a world of trees. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, forests exploded across the landscape. Where there had once been endless vistas of open steppe, where you could see for miles and track the movements of the great herds, there was now a dense green wall. Pine, birch, and oak trees marched across continents, claiming the land with a silent, relentless advance. For people whose ancestors had lived in open country for 1,000 generations, this must have been profoundly disorienting, even claustrophobic. The sky, which had been an immense, ever-present dome, was now something you only glimpsed through a canopy of leaves. The wind no longer carried scents from miles away. It rustled the leaves right next to your ear. The entire sensory experience of being alive had changed. This new forested world presented a completely different set of challenges. You couldn't just throw a long, heavy spear in a dense woodland. The hunting techniques that had worked so brilliantly on the open steppe were now useless. You couldn't surround a herd of mammoths in a forest. You couldn't even see a herd in a forest. The animals themselves were different. The age of giants was over. The new fauna was smaller, faster, and much more elusive. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs. These creatures didn't travel in vast, predictable herds. They were solitary, or lived in small groups. They were wary, quick to bolt, and perfectly at home in the dense undergrowth. Stalking a roe deer in a thicket required a completely different kind of patience, stealth, and technology than confronting a mammoth on an open plain. The entire rhythm of life had to change. Instead of following the great seasonal migrations of a single species, people had to become intimately familiar with a much smaller territory. They had to learn the habits of dozens of different species. They had to become true masters of the forest, learning its secret paths, its hidden resources, its quiet language. It was a more localized, more diversified, and in many ways a more complex way of life. And to meet these new challenges, they needed a new toolkit. The big, heavy, beautifully made spear points of the Solutrean and Magdalenian cultures, the so-called Stone Age laurel leaves, were artifacts of a bygone era. They were masterpieces of flint knapping, but they were the tools of big game hunters. In the new world of the forest, something else was needed. The technological response was a masterpiece of miniaturization. This is the era of the microlith. Instead of creating a single, large spear point, the Mesolithic flint knappers, the people of this Middle Stone Age, learned to produce tiny, geometrically shaped blades of flint, triangles, trapezoids, crescents. They were small, often no bigger than a fingernail, but they were incredibly sharp and standardized. They were like the interchangeable parts of a Swiss Army knife. These tiny blades weren't used on their own. They were set in rows into slots carved into bone or wooden shafts, held in place with birch bark tar or sinew. This created a composite tool. You could create a fearsome, serrated cutting edge for a knife. You could create a viciously barbed tip for an arrow or a harpoon. The genius of it was its efficiency and versatility. A single core of good flint could now produce hundreds of these tiny, lethal components. And if one of the barbs broke off in an animal, you didn't have to discard the entire weapon. You could just pry out the broken piece and slot in a new one. It was modular, repairable, and perfectly adapted to the new demands of their environment. This microlithic technology spread across the world, a clear sign of how successfully people were adapting to the post-glacial conditions, and it was often paired with the single most important hunting innovation since the spear, the bow and arrow. We don't know exactly where or when the bow and arrow was invented, but it was during this great period of transition that it became a dominant piece of hunting technology, and it was a game-changer. A spear is an extension of your arm. Its power and range are limited by your own strength. It's a close-quarters weapon. You have to get dangerously close to your prey. A bow is a machine. It's a device for storing energy. When you draw the string, you are loading the limbs of the bow with potential energy, far more than you could generate in a single throwing motion. When you release, that energy is transferred to the arrow, with incredible speed and efficiency. It allowed a hunter to project a small, sharp, lethal point with great accuracy over a much longer distance. In the dense forest, this was a revolutionary advantage. You could now kill an animal from 60 or 70 yards away, from behind the cover of a tree, without it ever knowing you were there. It was silent, deadly, and perfectly suited for hunting the wary, solitary animals of the new woodland environment. It opened up a whole new world of hunting possibilities. The bow and arrow was the signature weapon of the Mesolithic, the tool that allowed humanity to master the forest just as the great thrusting spear had allowed them to master the mammoth steppe. But the adaptation wasn't just about hunting. The whole menu had to change. The age of relying on a single massive source of calories was over. The new watchword was diversity. This period is what some archaeologists call the broad-spectrum revolution. Instead of focusing narrowly on a few species of large mammals, people began to exploit a much wider range of resources. The rivers, which had once been frozen for much of the year, were now teeming with fish. People developed sophisticated new ways to catch them. We find exquisitely crafted bone fishhooks, multi-pronged harpoons called leisters for spearing salmon and eel, and the first evidence of woven nets and fish traps. They built weirs, complex fence-like structures to channel fish into traps in a way that allowed them to harvest them on an almost industrial scale. Fish became a reliable, storable source of protein. They could be smoked and dried, providing a buffer against lean times. The skies, too, were full of food. They hunted waterfowl, ducks, geese, swans with a new intensity, likely using arrows with blunt tips or bunts, designed to stun the birds without destroying the meat. They collected eggs from nests. They were learning to exploit every single niche of their new, richer, more complex environment. And then there was the plant world. In the cold, dry Ice Age, edible plants were a relatively minor part of the diet in many northern regions, but in the warm, wet Holocene, the new geological epoch we still live in today, the forests were a wild garden. People began to gather a huge variety of nuts like hazelnuts and acorns, which were a fantastic source of fats and proteins. They learned to process them, to leach the tannins from acorns to make them edible, and to store them in pits for the winter. They gathered berries, roots, tubers, and mushrooms. This required a new kind of knowledge, a deep, encyclopedic botanical knowledge. You had to know which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were deadly poisonous. You had to know the right time of year to harvest each one. This was a science passed down through generations, primarily, we believe, by the women of the group. While the men might have been out hunting deer with their new bows, the women and children were engaged in the equally vital task of gathering, ensuring a stable and varied food supply. On the newly formed coastlines, another bonanza awaited. The rising sea levels had created vast, warm, shallow estuaries and intertidal zones, perfect habitats for shellfish. And so people became coastal foragers. All over the world, from Scotland to South Africa to Japan, we begin to see the appearance of enormous shell middens. These are, to be blunt, giant mounds of ancient garbage. They are composed of millions upon millions of discarded shells, oysters, mussels, limpets, clams. These middens are a beautiful record of a new way of life. They show us that people were settling down, at least for part of the year, in one place, intensively harvesting the reliable bounty of the sea. It wasn't glamorous food, it wasn't a mammoth, but it was always there. You just had to know the tides. This reliable, predictable food source may have been one of the keys that allowed human populations to grow and stabilize after the chaos of the Great Thaw. All of this, the new tools, the new foods, the new landscapes, created a new kind of human being, a Mesolithic mindset. The world was no longer a simple, brutal equation of man versus mammoth on an open field. It was a complex, intricate puzzle with 1,000 different pieces. To survive, you had to be a generalist, a jack of all trades. You had to be a skilled hunter, a patient fisherman, a knowledgeable botanist, and a master craftsman. You had to understand the rhythms of the forest, the tides, and the changing seasons with a new and profound intimacy. Their spiritual world likely changed as well. While we have no written records, the art seems to shift. The focus on the great animals, the bulls and bison and mammoths of the deep caves, gives way to something new. In places like Scandinavia and Spain, we see rock art that depicts scenes of human life. We see stick figures dancing, hunting with bows, fighting, gathering honey. The art has moved out of the sacred darkness of the cave and into the light of day. It seems to be telling stories not just of the cosmic order, but of the community itself. The focus perhaps was shifting inward, from the great spirit animals to the great human family. It's tempting to see this period as a step down, a sort of dark age between the glorious cave painters of the Paleolithic and the great farmers of the Neolithic. We call them hunter-gatherers, and it can conjure an image of a desperate, hand-to-mouth existence, but that's almost certainly wrong. For many, this was a golden age, the original affluent society, as one anthropologist called it. Their health was often excellent. Their diet was incredibly varied and nutritious, far more so than that of the early farmers who would follow them, who relied on a few starchy crops. They had a great deal of leisure time. They worked to meet their needs, and then they had time for storytelling, for music, for art, for family. They were living in a world of abundance, an Eden that had been born from the chaos of the Thaw. They had not only survived the end of their world, they had adapted, thrived, and created a new one that was, in many ways, richer and more sustainable than what had come before. They were the ultimate survivors. They had weathered the most dramatic climate shift in human history. They watched their coastlines drown, their traditional prey disappear, and their entire landscape transform. And they didn't just endure, they innovated. They invented new technologies, developed new social strategies, and built a new and resilient way of life. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Their deep knowledge of plants would eventually lead to the first experiments with cultivation. Their more settled way of life, in resource-rich areas, would pave the way for the first villages. Their growing populations would create the social pressures that would eventually spark the next great revolution, the invention of agriculture. But for now, here in the long twilight of the Stone Age, they were the masters of their world. The children of the Great Thaw, they had walked through the fire and the flood, and had emerged on the other side into a green, vibrant and welcoming world, a world they had earned through their ingenuity, their courage, and their incredible enduring resilience. They closed the final chapter of the Ice Age, and stood at the dawn of our own modern era, ready for whatever came next. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can feel a sense of that deep peace, the peace of having navigated a great storm and found a safe harbour, a quiet forest, a calm shore. The world had ended, and the world had begun anew.